my hero Whitehead is kind of sort of
Mm,
can't be placed on either side of that divide. So I try to avoid even, getting into that turf war.
right. Does
It's
Whitehead
interesting.
canonically get placed? So obviously the Principia has a sort of foundational place in the starting of analytic philosophy. I think one rarely hears Whitehead explicitly mentioned in the continental group. I mean, that obviously is a
French
kind of
Continentals really like him, but
right,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
right, right, right.
And I think there's a
Yeah.
bit Matt and I have talked about this. Like he does get explicitly mentioned by a lot of people, and we could name many names in that French continental lineage that do. But I think there are also other people, clearly notably Simondon, who don't mention him.
Mm,
But given that his mentors all mention him,
right.
like people like Georges Canguilhem, Gaston Bachelard, etc., the likelihood that Simondon was unaware of convergences between his way of thinking and Whitehead's is very slim. So
Mm,
he must have had at least some degree of familiarity. I think maybe he just didn't want to go there because there are key differences. Like it would have been really fascinating for that encounter to have really occurred, but maybe. Simondon was so busy, strawmanning Spinoza and Hegel and others that he didn't need to add Whitehead to that list of people he was going to, you know.
mhm.
But he leaves that up to me, to strawman Whitehead.
right, right, right. Yeah,
We
I
didn't
know
even talk about otherwise,
close.
Tim.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, that you guys have managed to make very fertile ground out of your respective differences on this stuff, which is like great fun to see. It's also great, like it's kind of amazing how tractable your conversations have been, just how many people are tuning in for these really like deep, in-depth
I'm
conversations about.
shocked. I don't, I've never
It's
thought at all.
amazing.
I've never thought about audience at all. I
Mm.
do this because I find it interesting.
Sorry, guys. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, yeah. Anyways,
You're the view bringer.
but I actually, I would assume people appreciate that because it's not, you know, canned. It's not like we're trying to capture a particular audience or be captured by an audience. It's just
Right,
we
right.
talk about what's interesting to us, and if folks are following and finding it valuable, that's great. But
Yeah,
I'm here to talk to you guys, you know?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think as we turn to the frame problem, I think the analytic continental thing is really interesting, and maybe we will come back to that. I don't know, but as we turn to the frame problem, it probably would be useful for the audience. I mean,
Mhm.
Matt, you're normally really good at setting the scene, so maybe you have something you want to say anyway. But I think also Darius could give a bit of an introduction to what the frame
Sure.
problem is in terms of its specific history, because then we're obviously going to go and say, no, this is a really generic problem, and it's
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
specific
yeah, yeah,
history
yeah.
is just one manifestation of something that's more, generic. But yeah, having that specific introduction would probably be useful for people who aren't necessarily familiar.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt, how do you do this? Do you just sort of do you do an introduction? I know your conversations like online, just they sort of I think they just
Pretty
fly into it,
informal.
right?
Yeah, pretty
Just
informal.
we just go. Okay, cool, cool, cool.
I don't think I've ever bothered to introduce Tim, but people know him well enough by now. But
Well, at
um,
some point, I want to know. I want to get to know. I want to find out how you two got to know one another. That's one thing I'm curious about.
Tim
That's
emailed me, what,
yeah,
4 years ago
yeah.
about
Cool,
Whitehead and evolution and noticed some
But yeah,
convergence.
but I mean, basically, it's a
cool.
really short story. I saw Matt on John Vervaeke's
Right,
podcast.
right, 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 right.
And I had been reading Whitehead, and then but I hadn't really come across and hadn't really sought out any popular treatments or all that much secondary literature. Like I got Whitehead from Stengers and Prigogine, I think. Um, and then, I've been reading Whitehead and feeling like he was very much a certain kind of fellow traveler. And then Matt, very lucidly as he does, talked about a bunch of aspects of Whitehead's thought with John. And of course, I agreed with a bunch and disagreed with a bunch, and a lot of that hasn't
Sure.
really changed all that much. I mean, part of that conversation was about the emergence emanation relationship, and I still probably have this is a can of worms, but I have a very sort of constructivist, but in the ontogenetic sense, not just in the social sense, um, view of how that relationship works, I suppose, like once something is constructed, it can emanate if you want, but I don't
Mm.
like the idea of a priori top-down, influences. And that's essentially the kind of thing that I try to minimize in my, broadly speaking, metaphysical project.
Yeah, right. Skyhooks.
Emergence, yeah. Yeah, skyhooks. So, I just what I think of as
Mm.
front loading the possibility landscape in some sense, right? Or front loading, just front loading in general. I'm just trying to
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
minimize what the postulate in metaphysics or speculative philosophy for me, like the job of speculative philosophy, um, as opposed to the way speculation appears in scientific theories and other stuff. We could talk about all this because this is very intimately relevant to the frame problem, actually. So the postulate being this kind of frame that we plonk down so that we can begin to reason about a space that is demarcated, delineated by that frame, right? So we define a context, which is the domain of applicability of a certain theory. And that's totally legitimate. And so all the effective theory stuff that I'm always critiquing in sort of physicalist science is totally legitimate, as an instrumental approach, right? And we couldn't do without it, right? But then in speculative philosophy, very specifically, to me, the primary task of that practice is the critique of the postulate to make it
Mm.
as just stripped back as possible. So I'm like, what are the minimal conditions of realization, I would say? Because
Right,
obviously,
right, right.
the constructivist, process relational type conception. So minimal conditions of realization. And so the whole thing is to be like fucking making it as minimal as possible.
Right. Well, I think this comes into, and we can maybe, yeah, again, we'll probably touch on this, is the thing that I mentioned to you and Jason, the concern that I think some people have without reading Simondon, Whitehead, and that literature, which is that it all feels a touch too anarchic, right? The move away from the autopoetic, for
Yeah.
example, the move away from kind of autopoetic stability as the ground norm from which other kind of normative constraints can emerge. I think some people have this concern, more like, but stability is a thing, like there's this constant tension between freedom and stability, which you find everywhere, right? You find it in the play literature. Grandin talks about it in terms of freedom and constraint. And I think people worry that when you strip back the first postulates, the first priors, I guess, you end up having excess freedom that can't be curtailed. So maybe that's something that we could get into, because it's the frame problem ultimately. I mean, it's that balance between being a thing that acts in a coherent way that's in line with your preferences, but isn't overly constrained by some given state space.
Yeah. Matt will have heaps to say about this because this is specifically Whitehead's problematic, I think, as well, right?
Right.
But just to say really briefly, I mean, slogan alert, all roads lead to ontological anarchy. So yes, it's intentionally anarchistic in the sense that I'm saying that we want to minimize the arcade, right? So what is the minimal arcade? If you're talking about something metaphysical, of course there are arcade all over the place, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There are origins, just like, well, I won't get into the Whitehead thing because Matt can go there. But this excess freedom that cannot be curtailed, yes, of course, I'm affirming that, and I'm saying that is necessary for the kind of open-ended evolution that I believe is a reality, and I believe that based on empirical evidence as much
Sure.
as anything, right? Because I'm not willing to subjugate what I would call the prosaic, but the empirical evidence to the speculative rationalization of it, right? But what the hard sell, right, is because we've been used to thinking in certain ways for so long. A hard sell, and this is why when people don't get, say, Darwinian evolution or what, they're like, oh, so you're saying everything's random, like everything's an accident, and it's like, yeah, no one's saying that. Well, maybe some people are saying that, but no, I'm
Right.
certainly not saying that. But I'm saying the possibility of something that is non-arbitrary, non-accidental, non-whatever, random. Random is another buzzword. Is constructed, right? Is not preordained, that there is a
Yeah.
specific distribution of possibilities that is there from the get-go. So of course stability is real. And for someone like Simondon and his solving of the frame problem in a slightly different way from Whitehead, which I'll hand over to Matt, the individual is real for Simondon. This is really important, right? The individual is real, but it's a phase in being, so it's relativized. It's not refuted.
Mm.
He's not saying that there isn't something akin to what a poiesis, or that being um, is not differentiated. It's incredibly different. It's a theory of differentiation, right? It's a theory of how stability emerges without having been preordained, essentially, right? He's like, if we want to account for the existence of real individuals and sort of stable loci and all of that kind of stuff without having recourse to a transcendent principle of stabilization that predates everything, then we need to get into the weeds in the way that Simondon tries to. So
Mm.
it's kind of I get the concern that the concern exists, because it's exactly the same concern, as I say, people have about you know quote unquote Darwinism or whatever, right? But what's really counterintuitive and really difficult seemingly about these ideas, even though they're not new, is that starting from something that is more or less quote unquote arbitrary. And again, it's a problematic term. We can get things like we can get meanings, we can get values, we can get stability, we can get teloi, we can get goals.
Mm.
Darwin is, again, this is sort of another sloganistic way of putting it, but he's not refuting purpose. He's trying to naturalize purpose. He's saying, like, how does purpose emerge without it being, preordained?
Right.
That's exactly the Simondon problematic as well. It's never to get rid of those things. And
Mm.
again, cutting to the chase, for me, those things are more real. Their reality is not threatened by the fact that they're constructed. They're more real for the fact of their construction, their imminent construction. Because if we just posit them as kind of abstract, principles at the beginning, to me, that threatens their reality. It's like that they're imminently constructed, so emergent in a certain sense, another really problematic word, emergence, is what kind of safeguards their reality for me. Because I'm not wanting to engage in what I think is a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. They're real because they're concrete and here, and they have a constructive, genesis. There's a genealogy. Whereas taking the abstract posit as more real than the prosaic constructed given, to me, that would be a fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean the tangle, or maybe it's a tango that Tim and I always end up in is around the extent to which Whitehead is truly constructivist through and through, because on the one hand, everything from the geometry of space-time to all the laws of physics for Whitehead, that's all historically emergent. And so, as he would say, he's a
Mm.
thoroughgoing evolutionist in terms of the nature of enduring forms. But rather than, even though, and he also has his ultimate category of creativity, which is not unlike Tim's variation first, sort of ontogenetic principle. But Whitehead also has the primordial nature of God and eternal objects, um, which are a real sticking point. And I think it's important to differentiate what he means by eternal objects at the metaphysical level from what we might mean by a fixed law of nature or a fixed state space or something, um, which I think is really what he's trying to avoid having to say at the cosmological level, because he's really trying to affirm open-ended creative advance. He just thinks, you know, variation is always going to exist. I mean, we could frame it epistemologically. We can't even think variation without invariance. Like these categories sort of depend on one another for their sense. Um, but ontologically speaking, we wouldn't, there's no way to really say everything is change, or change is the only constant, because already you're referencing constancy. And
Mm.
And so we get into these paradoxes, the coincidence of opposites, right? And so it's hard for me to understand variation as a, well, as the new arche or anarche, if you want, without already sort of presupposing, at least in the background of our thought, that there's some kind of invariance there, even if it's variation itself. And in terms of purpose and meaning and everything, I think obviously there's a continual proliferation of new purposes and new meanings as life evolves, as the universe evolves. But I think Whitehead's trying to do justice to our, I mean, he's really an experiential philosopher. He's not a phenomenologist. We could talk about the difference between phenomenology um, and Whitehead's attempt to understand experience. I think they're distinct in important ways. And phenomenology is always sort of bracketing, things like, well, the nature of causality and these metaphysical questions just to attend to what arises in consciousness. And Whitehead's not really interested in consciousness. He's more interested in the
Mm,
non-conscious forms of experience, he would say, bodily feeling, emotion, moods, and almost Heideggerian, although Heidegger's,
mhm,
I know he's a phenomenologist, but more in the existential phenomenologist sense. But when Whitehead talks about the primordial nature of God, Tim sees that as a posit, a postulate to get things going, to understand how you get something definite and actual out of infinite possibility. And I can see that, but I also, you know, if we take Whitehead at his word, he says that this is really a fact. It's the primordial fact, by which he means there's something in the very nature of our experience, and this relates to the frame problem, that grants us a sense of relevant novelty moment by moment.
mm,
And he thinks that that's what he calls the primordial nature of God. Obviously, he's choosing a very loaded term there that has a fraught history, and it might be more trouble than it's worth, but I think he chooses it because he wants to point in that direction. Um,
right.
so, let's talk about your paper though, because I think,
Yeah.
one way to frame why I found this paper so delightful really is because you're
Oh, well,
working
thanks.
from the inside,
Yeah.
speaking to active inference theorists and people who work with that framework in the language that they want to be spoken to about it. Um, but you're pointing out its limitations in terms of solving this frame problem, which has existed since classical AI. Um, you know, I got to meet Marvin Minsky as an undergrad, and he was talking about his Emotion Machine book back then.
Mm,
Um, didn't like the guy at all, and he was probably on his way to Epstein Island, but that's another story. I was at UCF in Orlando, Florida, so. But you have a way of working from within active inference to show that there are these infinite regresses and all these different ways that you might try to solve the frame problem. You don't end up getting there. And I think as a philosopher, my interest, and I studied cognitive science, as an undergrad, and I continue to be interested in it. I was always, though, taken by an activism
mm,
because it, unlike the computationalist approach or cognitivism, seemed to me to resist this temptation to imagine that cognitive science is simply in the business of explaining human personhood or conscious agency in terms of subpersonal mechanisms of some kind, whether
right.
predictive processing or Bayesian inference or whatever. Whereas the inactivists were like, well, wait a minute. That's to get off on the wrong foot philosophically, and that we're never going to be able
Mm,
to get behind our own conscious experience because it's consciousness that first discloses the world to us, and then we start doing science within that phenomenological horizon. We're never going to, as you could use Sellers as manifest and scientific images here. And I thought that you handled that question well by sort of bracketing it and saying, okay, that's a real
mm.
philosophical issue. And you shared, or Tim shared, your paper on Iris Murdoch, where I think you're getting more into that kind of territory there. I found
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I didn't get to spend as much time with that paper as the active inference one, but I can see that you're probably very interested in a similar question of, again, to put it in Sellers's terms, like the manifest and the scientific image, and what are we really trying to do in cognitive science? Offer
Right.
useful descriptions that are of instrumental value, or are we really trying to explain what consciousness is, how human beings
Mm.
work in a way that, from the perspective of our own everyday consciousness, we can't even access, but that science can tell us that, oh, look, listen, this is what's really going on. You're some kind of a complex mechanism. Um,
Right.
and so maybe from there, well, I wonder if you do struggle with that question as well. But maybe from there, you can also just like lead us into what motivated this paper, and then I'm
Sure.
curious how colleagues in the active inference community responded to it.
Right, right. Cool. Well, thank you for your kind words. That's very nice to hear that you enjoyed it. There's a bunch of things to
Should we,
say. Sorry,
should
Tim,
we
go ahead.
say,
Yeah.
yeah, I just want to say, let's just give the name of the paper, as sometimes people get annoyed at me and Matt because we're like, this paper,
I
that
always
paper.
link
It's
to
fine.
it. I always link to
I know, but they want us to say it, in the flow of the conversation.
Hubert
So,
Dreyfus reference, what active inference still can't do, the frame problem that just won't go away.
That's absolutely it. Yeah, yeah. It's absolutely a Dreyfus reference both to the sort of 72 original book, What Computers Can't Do, and then the 92 second edition, What Computers Still Can't Do, which I'm teaching. I'm teaching both philosophy of consciousness and sort of philosophy of AI to two different cohorts at Macquarie. That's where I'm doing my PhD. And I always when they want to posit the LLM as this kind of sui generis superpower, I say, go back and read some Bert Dreyfus, because he was really on the ball. And the conflicts with him and Minsky are sociologically very interesting as well, about how he was trying to get sort of ushered out of almost the academic scene. But yeah, it's of course an allusion to Dreyfus. Dreyfus has been a hero of mine for a long time. We can talk about sort of the historical basis of it. Just to say about the metaphysics kind of terrifies me, in truth. It's, as someone who is trained in psychology, cognitive science, linguistics actually is my kind of formal introduction to cognitive science. So reading a lot of Chomsky and then a fair bit of Fodor was sort of my foray into that. They don't touch the metaphysical question. I mean, Chomsky is getting there with a kind of refusal of the tabula rasa, but he's not doing the full-blown nature of the universe and whatnot. So my starting point is typically cognitive science, but I think as we will speak about, one sees this same kind of issue and the motifs that this issue raises emanate through metaphysics, cognitive science, consciousness studies, I think even ethics, right? Ultimately, a kind of question of how does the ball get rolling on intelligibility, on intelligent behavior. Tim.
no, just to say one thing you didn't mention is biology, and this is
Sure.
the
Yeah.
this is the problem Darwin is addressing. All right.
Right.
Yeah, continue.
Which
Sorry.
is ultimately like strikes one as a kind of almost a theological concern. I have another paper where I talk about the inflated frame problem, which maybe we can get into, where it's ultimately a problem of origins. So we can get into this, but just to say that I'm terrified by the metaphysics, and you'll have to pardon my lack of knowledge of Whitehead, Simondon, and the rest. So what motivated this paper is actually, interestingly, it's a kind of self-critique. I wrote a paper 2 years ago in Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences called How Preferences Enslave Attention, calling into question the exogenous-endogenous distinction in active inference. That is a distinction typically made in attentional studies between purposive, self-driven attention, such as the kind of attention I'm deploying right now, versus the type of attention that would happen if the alarm went off and I seem to be passively captured by the alarm. And active inference, for a number of reasons, calls this kind of distinction into question, where everything if you're an instrumentalist about this, can be described as maximizing model evidence, and so therefore is ultimately agentic, self-serving, and so on. But there's a last bit of that paper where I spoke about the kind of fact that our attentional regimes seem to be structured in a certain way, such that, for example, if the fire alarm goes off and I see a fire, as important as this conversation is to me, I'm paying attention to that fire and I'm getting the hell out of the building. So I say something like, I kind of use the language of dynamical systems theory and the stuff that sort of people like Scott Kelso talk about, the attractor wells in which attention takes place, some are deeper than others and some are consumed by others. And I think the implicit point that was always made at active inference was the fundamental attractor set, or the fundamental attractor well, is homeostasis, such that the moment I get hungry, the moment my body is at risk of burning up, that's the thing that I pay attention to, and I act to fulfill that preference over and above everything else. So I had that kind of idea, and that was really very much building off what a lot of other people had said in active inference. And then I think it was reading stuff that Andy Clark had written about with respect to novelty and surprise, where he goes, well, you know, one story here has been that, yes, we always have these upweighted preferences regarding our biological homeostatic self-concern, and yet that doesn't seem to quite allow for the flexibility, the dynamism, the idiosyncrasy that actual cognitive behavior evinces. So Andy says in his kind of colloquial style, you know, it doesn't explain why one day you fancy a Chinese meal, one day you fancy a Mexican meal, right? Like everything is constrained and determined by this uppermost goal. So I think that kind of got the cogs whirring. And then to concretize it, there was a paper early last year by Tom Darling, Andrew Corcoran, and Jakob Hovey in Philosophical Psychology, claiming that active inference can explain, so not just describe, but can explain the resolution of the frame problem. And I thought, okay, well, I've got to put pen to paper on this. In part, also, final thing I'll say before I shut up about the kind of genesis of this paper, my PhD, what originally was kind of active inference and Heideggerian, neo-Heideggerian phenomenology, it's morphed into this active inference and the problem of relevance, in part because I think this is the central thing that Heidegger and definitely Dreyfus were getting at in their phenomenological and existential analyses. So it actually all kind of came beautifully together that this question was growing in import for a lot of people. Of course, people like John Vervaeke have been talking about this for God knows how many years. And as you say, it's a problem that dates back to 1969 is when the term was actually first used. But with respect to it being the theme of my PhD and a number of active inference papers coming out claiming that the grand unifying theory that is active inference can solve the frame problem was the kind of catalyst for writing this paper.
Mm.
You still might want to just tell us, Darius, in very succinctly, what exactly the frame problem is.
Sure.
For those not familiar.
Yeah. So the frame problem is originally, as I said, so the frame problem, the term was first used in 1969, I believe by McCarthy and Hayes. And it describes a problem, the original frame problem describes a problem in classical logicist AI, so AI that was based on using the predicate calculus, which was how can we encode the effects of action without encoding, without having to deal with all the irrelevant effects of action that might ensue. So that was a problem that was just entailed by the structure of the predicate calculus. And one thing you could say is there's this kind of famous phrase, and maybe Fodor who spoke about it, sort of let sleeping dogs lie. As the engineer, well, you go, okay, obviously this is going to change and this is going to stay the same. But that doesn't really solve the problem of relevance. It assumes the resolution of the problem of relevance because you're already saying, well, I know before anything even happens what's going to be most relevant here and what's not. And what people like Dreyfus point out is that the world is far more volatile than that. I think Horgeland's got a nice quote where he goes, world isn't as nicely structured as all that. And so the moment that you start building out all of these contingencies and if-then structures, if this happens, then do this, you end up with an internal model essentially as large as the world itself that then becomes intractable to navigate. Now, it's been argued by certain people that the classical problem in GoFi, in good old-fashioned AI, as Horgeland put it, has been solved. But the problem has been taken up by cognitive sciences and philosophers of mind, which is essentially the question of, as I like to talk about it, how do cognitive agents like us zero in on what's most salient to us or most relevant to us in our regimes of action and perception, where attention can kind of be encompassed within action? And it seems so self-evident that we do, such that like there are indefinitely many things that I could be doing right now, even within the confines of this room. Like I could be punching the TV or throwing my coffee cup all over the place, but I'm not, because it isn't really in line with my preferences, my goals, my fears, and so on and so forth. That capacity to intelligently ignore everything that's irrelevant to us while managing to stay on track with things that are relevant to us seems so obvious that someone like Dreyfus, for example, says that we don't solve the frame problem because we are thrown organisms in the Heideggerian sense. We are in the world directly resonating with relevance. But the problem is someone like Mike Wheeler, for example, who's really important in this discussion, says, well, the cognitive scientists aren't going to be happy with that. You know, that's not an answer that science is in the game of, that, well, we just resonate or are open to or are receptive of what's most relevant to us. So the question of using the techniques of cognitive science, how can we explain how we manage to track what is relevant to us given the types of things that we are and the types of things that we are constantly changing to be, is the problem of relevance. And if anyone is interested, I would say the kind of locus classicus of the discussion of this is a book by Pilishin. Well, Pilishin is the editor. It's called The Robot's Dilemma. It's from 1987, and it contains the classical texts by Fodor, Pilishin, Horgeland, Dreyfus, Dennett. Dennett has a very famous paper about this, where they outline this problem and more or less state that this is just an intractable problem. I mean, I think Dreyfus's paper was actually with his brother, is why the frame problem is a problem, but you don't have to worry about it, or something like that. You know, so that is the relevance problem, and then we can get into perhaps how active inference at least seems to be able to get a grip on that problem.
Seems.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the last part of my question was how your colleagues in the active inference community have responded. I know it just came out last year, but
yeah.
had
So
a
it came
chance
out in October. So, you know, spoiler, I don't think active inference can solve the frame problem. The way that I hash it out in the paper, I kind of hedge my bets, is that I go, thus far, the attempts to resolve the frame problem by the active inference program or framework have failed.
Mm-hmm.
Because there have been explicit attempts to resolve this problem, I guess for that kind of framing, I don't need to say whether it's an intractable problem outright. So maybe that saves me some excoriation. But no one has seemed to express any particular anger. Interestingly, Carl Friston and Thomas Parr, who's also a very sort of big player in the technical side of active inference, they both read the paper and seemed at least happy with the technical details and were, I guess, kind of unwilling to comment on the philosophical implications. And I think some of this, Matt, comes to your point about what is the aim of this framework when it comes to description versus explanation. There is arguably a growing move in active inference to describe itself purely as a descriptive framework. And so in that case, sure, you can absolutely describe in terms of the mechanisms that active inference poses the resolution of the frame problem. You can describe using those mechanisms how, in principle, we could cascade on what's most relevant to us, but it's not an explanation. And so we can get into the kind of philosophy of science on what that means. But yeah, so no angry emails, no angry tweets. I haven't been kicked out the gang entirely. I mean, all of this to say as well that, like, I am also trying to think more constructively and positively about how active inference could get a handle on the frame problem. So this is work that I have under review. So I certainly don't think that the framework should therefore be thrown out writ large. I think it has lots and lots of things to say of interest that are tractable, that are realist, that make genuinely interesting and testable claims. And I think you can also use those resources to actually do a better job at dealing with the frame problem. So maybe that's why I haven't received any, disowning emails.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I was quite scared.
I have I don't know if you wanted to go somewhere, Tim, but I have a brief follow-up perhaps for you, Darius, just about
Yeah.
whether we frame it in terms of uh, the Seller's distinction between manifest and scientific image, or Tim distinguishes between the prosaic and the inquired. Do you think that the goal of, say, an explanation, if active inference were an explanation, that would entail the scientific image is going to trump
Hmm.
the manifest image versus a description where we're just more comfortable saying, well, these are just two different ways of describing the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. In a sense, like the vast majority of the active inference community are engaged in solely the scientific image, I would say. Not that they wouldn't be informed by the manifest image or the way that the world is disclosed to us, but they're
Uh,
ultimately interested in trying to sort of get underneath that. Um,
Right. But you seem, and I mean, one of the ways that I was making sense of your argument is basically saying
mm,
that the active inference theorists are, in some sense, when they claim that they've solved the frame problem, they're just
yeah,
assuming the manifest image, where it's, as Dreyfus would say, well, we're not really solving it. It's sort of happening. I don't know how to frame it exactly, but it's happening for us. But it's like
right, right, right.
the difference between how we do it as conscious human beings studying hypothetical systems or some other, living
Yeah,
organism
yeah,
and
yeah.
model on it. We think we've solved it, but really that's just because we don't have to solve it from the point of view of the man.
Right, right, right. So I think there's a kind of elision that takes place where the kind of claim that you would make, the Dreyfusian claim that we don't have to solve it, is anathema to the kind of ambitions of a framework like active inference. Active inference would take this as a genuine computational problem, I think, that needs resolving at the level of the algorithmic or the computational level, to use kind of Mars levels, and also at some point the physical implementation. So I think actually the Marian paradigm, which I use in the paper, was actually a late addition because of a reviewer who was saying, well, maybe you're just concerned here about physical implementation. It's not just that. Suffice it to say that the physical implementation details are light on the ground. It's also that the essential algorithm which they're interested in, and I guess which they inherit from someone like Marr, Fodor, and sort of cognitivist cognitive science, is ultimately inadequate. So I would argue they almost leave the manifest image behind. The fact that we can disclose a world that's relevant to us and what that disclosure means and is in a kind of very deep Heideggerian sense, I think is not a direct, it's not the question that they're trying to answer here. In part, I mean, it comes into conversations I've been having with Tim about the hard problem. It's ultimately that question of kind of the disclosure of meaning, significance, intelligibility. I think, as you say, is kind of taken for granted. That's another question that would have to be addressed, according to their kind of explanatory logic of addressing everything. But it's a hard problem to address, and so I think they park it when they're trying to deal with more specific, what they see as more specific computational problems.
Hmm. Interesting. All right. I have so much to ask, but what's on your mind, Tim?
oh yeah, I mean, I have far too much to say as always. And maybe we can, I don't know, crack the conversation open at this point, as well, and sort of talk about why this is a generic problem. And that to me also speaks to your concern about metaphysics, your fear of metaphysics, Darius. But really, I feel like metaphysics here is just, again, or speculative philosophy is this, critical attempt to work out which of the kind of structures or schemas or whatever are being discussed, patterns even are being discussed here, are truly generic.
Mm.
Um, So is the frame problem just this very specific issue in this very, specific area of inquiry of cognitive science, or is it in fact a generic problem that some version of it, which
Yeah.
we will be able to see at some level of abstraction, is structurally isomorphic, appears in all these different disciplines? And to say it was a metaphysical problem would really just be to say that, well, it appears in kind of everywhere. It's a
Right.
generic,
Right. Right.
it's a generic problem. And maybe we will get back to Whitehead. And I think again, the primordial nature of God and its function is to solve this problem in some sense, right? At the metaphysical level, like in the most general of ways. But so what's really interesting is this notion that we are trying to get behind the manifest image or beneath the manifest image or something like that, which you say is the express goal, and we know is the express goal of like a lot of it's not necessarily of science per se, but of a certain
Mm.
philosophical approach to, which is almost like trying to explain away the manifest image to uncover something that's more real, that's hidden behind it. That, by the way, is a very Platonic notion. But
Right. Right. Right.
I mean, so that already is I mean, it's a certain understanding of Plato. You know that that's true, Matt. Uh, it's the peering behind the thing and perceiving the noumenon or the forms directly. This idea that appearances are deceptive and there's something that we can uncover behind them that is somehow more
It's just that
real.
for Plato, it
Uh,
would be to peer behind the mechanistic veil into a
Yeah,
deeper
yeah,
sort of
for
within.
sure. But
Right.
again, at a certain level of abstraction, the problematic is the same.
Reality distinction. I mean, that's
Yeah,
yeah.
there are appearances, and we might disagree. Books going everywhere about what are appearances and what are, the noumena or whatever. But this ambition, and predicated on this notion that appearances are deceptive, and we want to get behind them to discover like the true, is that same, kind of ambition. And that's part of also what makes it inherently a kind of quasi-metaphysical problem, and that's why we will always say, Matt is always saying that physicalism or mechanicism or whatever is a metaphysical position. It might claim that it
Yeah.
isn't, but it's doing exactly the same kind of thing that any metaphysics would do or any speculative philosophy would do, which is not, it may be trying to explain away the appearances, which speculative philosophy may or may not be doing, but speculative philosophy is trying to infer from appearances to general, properties, patterns, forms, whatever, that we don't necessarily perceive directly in themselves, but from our, systematic study of appearances, we can say like, well, in order for things to appear in the way that they do, there would have to be this general rule, governing or whatever, but behind appearances. And that is the general modus operandi of speculative thinking, which is why I would, I often do say, but there is a lot of speculative thought just in physics or in effective theorization or whatever, like identifying a privileged basis of reduction for an effective
Right.
theory. That like so saying this coarse graining is the coarse graining that is most general and most applicable to whatever I'm trying to do or to this entire domain. That is an exercise in speculative thought. And even I call it speculative fiction, whereas I would say speculative philosophy again is specifically the critical intervention in that process to say like, how can we minimize this and also ask, which of these patterns is truly most general. So I think things intersect there,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
the way this same problem, I think, you're talking in your paper about active inference and sort of process theory, predictive processing, etc. Process theories that are more or less underpinned by the free energy principle, which you mention at some point and then say, but that's not what this paper is about. But the same problem appears at the generic level in the free energy principle, which is the problem of the origins of the novel
Yeah.
non-equilibrium steady states, right? The
Yeah.
origins of these attractor wells. So it's all well and good to say, one attractor well is deeper than another, and that we, shift back and forth, but we're pulled into different attractors, into the orbit of different attractors, whatever, into different wells. by context, by the environment or whatever. But the deep question is, well, where does that structure come from in the first place, right? And so in the free energy principle, that question might be answered. I mean, I've asked Carl this question directly and answered by a gesturing to the synergetics of Hermann Haken, which is a story about how, the order parameters that keep a system entrained to a particular attractor state break down under certain degrees of perturbation. The system goes into a kind of chaotic phase, and then it's kind of like phase shifting. It ends up being captured by another attractor. But that's actually not the story we want. That doesn't answer the question, because in the Haken type approach, in the non-equilibrium thermodynamics approach, that attractor landscape pre-exists. It's the predefined state space of any effective theory. The genesis of those attractors is still not part of the theory itself. Similarly, so you can make an appeal to dissipative adaptation, the work of Jeremy England, etc., which Carl would also make an appeal to. And I think that's telling the right type of story, but the way that it's formalized, again, and this may just be the nature of formalism itself, which is that it's formal, i.e. that the forms are, baked into it in some sense, right? And this can get us back to Whitehead at some point, but
it always goes back to Whitehead.
It always goes back to Whitehead. There's still this problem of the pre-statement of the landscape, right? And that's the yeah, go on.
Well, no, it might be worth explicating why that's a problem at the cognitive, like why that problem shows up at the cognitive scientific level.
Yeah.
And the reason ultimately for this is that active inference, when it discusses decision making, resorts to a scheme of what has been labeled hierarchical motivated control. So this is the work of people like Giovanni Pezzulo, but this is also Kristen as well. And the idea would be there that you have a top-down constraint-based scheme where you have a set of priors that ensure that every other policy is constrained, contextualized, determined by that overall telos, right?
Yeah.
So the problem that I kind of pose in this paper is, well, okay, so, for example, I think the example in the paper is your friend bursts through the door at a birthday party, but you have something else that you can pay attention to at a birthday party. How do you decide between the two? And this has to be explained by active inference, right? Because they have to explain everything. So they would resort to a kind of hierarchical motivated scheme. Now, I don't know how technical we need to go into this, but ultimately, the way that those policies are determined, rather than the agent doing mere epistemic foraging or information seeking, is by a thing called precision, a parameter called precision. Precision is technically, mathematically, the inverse variance of a probability distribution. But we can just think of it as kind of the priority that a signal or a belief is given. And again, I can talk to why precision renders one preferred observation more desirable than any other option, why it becomes salient to you, why it becomes relevant to you. But the point that I try to make in that paper is, well, so you have to precision weight a particular set, well, technically it's a set of observations, a preference tensor. Where does that precision weighting come from? Well, it requires another policy. Well, policies, again, are driven by highly weighted preferences. Okay, so now I need another set of highly weighted preferences associated with that policy. Well, how do they get highly weighted? Ad infinitum, ad infinitum, ad infinitum. So I was going to say that when it comes to first postulates, first priors, which maybe I can explain what I mean by that, I actually think there's good reason why they've implicitly done that move. And maybe it's the implicit reason that shows up in Aristotle's notion of primum movens, or Whitehead's, again, I don't want to speak out of turn, but Whitehead's notion of the primordial God, because it stops this infinite regress, ultimately. I mean, that is the Aristotelian move in a way. And Plato does it, I guess, in his own way with the theory of the forms and then the form of the good. But it's having to have in place what I actually call in the paper, I don't know if I call it in this paper or the other one on the inflated frame problem, a ground norm, which is actually a term borrowed from Hans Kelsen, who's a legal theorist, which is, his notion is needs to be a ground law which grants validity to all the other laws. There needs to be a ground norm that sets in place this precision weighting scheme that determines that what you're going to do is really relevant to you given this first prior. The problem is, of course, is that like we are way more flexible than the first prior would ever allow us to be. So the idea would be that, okay, so ultimately maybe my decision to look at my friend who's burst through the door is because I want to be a good friend and I don't want to upset anyone. And that's my first prior. That's my ultimate value. That's at the top of my hierarchy. And yet, if that logic is true, according to active inference, everything I would ever do is constrained by that goal. And people might go, well, you're just being way too, like, this is kind of straw manning the theory. But think about what would happen if you had to act in line with another first prior, right? So maybe now you're hungry and you need to fulfill that need. Well, you would need another precision weighting scheme predicated on a higher set of preferences to tune the precision weight of those first priors, thereby re-invoking the problem of relevance. So you get basically stuck on two sides of a horn. One is an infinite regress in a brain that no one expects to regress, and the other is overly determined a first prior. It's not even a set of first priors, because you would have to, in synchronically speaking, you would have to at points determine which of those first priors is most relevant. So they ultimately have to make this recourse to something that is underpinning the whole scheme and sets the thing in motion. And yet it doesn't allow for the generation of novel forms, the generation of novel activity, or actually any idiosyncratic activity that seems in any way contrary to, anti, or even just irrelevant to that overarching scheme. And whether we like it or not, if we just look at the manifest image, we're doing that the whole time. Like, this conversation, it's going to be hard. I mean, I have a discussion in my new paper that's under review about suicide. It's very hard to boil that down to a homeostatic norm. And Matt, maybe it's interesting you mentioned inactivism. This is stuff that Tim and I have been discussing with colleagues. Inactivism arguably falls into the same kind of problem because of its autopoietic core. And this is stuff that recent theorists, there was a paper in PCS this year by this guy called Wirtz. He points out, it's very difficult to build a architecture of sensory motor regimes built out of a core of a homeostatic core, right? Like, you just don't get that kind of flexibility, idiosyncrasy. So all of this to say that I am absolutely in agreement with both of you that I think, which is that if this is a speculative issue in the sense that it is a motif that reiterates throughout philosophy, I've just mentioned that it appears even in the philosophy of law, but it's, just how the hell does anything get validated? Does the ball get rolling? Then I guess I'm doing speculative philosophy. But yeah, no, I can't believe I just said that.
It's not that scary.
But
See, we're all
is,
here. We're fine. That's good.
At least at the cognitive scientific level, that is one of the horns of computational intractability that the frame problem presents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but exactly what I was just going to intervene really briefly and say, Darius, is you're already doing what I think of as metaphysics anyway, right? You're already doing speculative philosophy. And the reason you might get a sort of slightly nonplussed, response from certain, theorists who are very specifically attendant to a problem in cognitive science or whatever is because you're doing that, because you're like, yeah, but I'm digging down and I'm trying to find what's the origin here.
Right.
And the reason to me, and this is, why, I would also say it's the Darwinian problem, or it's the biological problematic, like genesis of novel norms, which, by the way, Georges Canguilhem, the French philosopher who wrote a lot about norms and pathology, blah, 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 like he fully recognized that the genesis of novel norms is the Darwinian biological problematic par excellence. And like you said earlier, Darius, and Matt and I have discussed this ad nauseum, but this is a theological problem, and we're talking about like the major divergences in the most generic ways of conceptualizing the world, right?
Right.
And you might also think, well, I'm not doing speculative philosophy. I'm just doing, this is just reasoning. I'm just applying sort of logical principles, blah, blah. But this is why people like Peirce, and I hope we'll get to talk about abduction, because this is also the problem of abduction, which again, major inspiration from Darwin on Peirce's way of thinking there. But is for people like that and for people like Whitehead, and really for all, I don't know, Matt, you can speak to this probably slightly better than I can, but all of this like serious metaphysicians, logic and metaphysics are was already kind of the same thing anyway, right? And that's what is the difference between someone like Peirce, who is a great logician. I mean, he considered himself one of the three greatest logicians in the history of Western philosophy, whatever, but he's pretty great. For him, those two things were always already to, and he identified himself with Kant actually in that sense as well. He thought he was a greater logician than Kant, but that, Kant had understood that logical, reasoning about categories and metaphysics were essentially the same thing.
Right.
Of course, the other two that Peirce puts, in his own company are Leibniz and Aristotle. But yeah, this way, so it is, you're speaking about the problem of origins, and
Yeah.
it seems so counterintuitive for a lot of people, seemingly, just because the way we've been trained to think. I think the mainstream, and whether this is a misappropriation of Plato and Aristotle and all that is kind of irrelevant to us. It's the way those ideas have sort of become mainstreamed in the history of Western thought is a systematic concealment of Genesis. Concealment of precisely this problem. And I mean, this opens onto some, I haven't read your LLM paper yet, Darius, but this opens onto the big issue there and the sort of product-oriented nature of our culture. And, why should it matter if this is LLM generated or I wrote it? The product, look at the product. All of that's like, it is an incredibly generic problem. And it is, it's the problem of law, yes. It's the problem Deleuze and Guattari, say hello. But also, again, Canguilhem and norms, but also Hume, Jay Garfield, the Buddhist philosopher and cognitive scientist, wrote a book, in 2018 or so, it was published on Hume called The Concealed Influence of Custom. And it's all about how Hume's thoroughgoing conventionalism is derived from his study of English common law and stuff, and so,
right.
We would get into Deleuze and obviously Nietzsche, but the distinction between, morality and ethics, but, jurisprudence versus, laws that are, jurisprudence as in case-by-case adjudication versus laws that are considered to somehow have some kind of eternal validity. So now you're into the problem between like conservatism and progressivism. Like just to say that all of these things are linked at some very fundamental level. And I think by delving down into the problem from a very specific disciplinary context, as you are in cognitive science, you're delving deep enough to reveal that generality. And that's just the same for me. Like I'm just coming out of biology in some sense, it's like digging into the problems of biology just becomes, speculative philosophy and it's the disavowal of that also, and the specific modern variant of it in physicalism, mechanicism, whatever, the disavowal of that delving beneath the priors, that again contributes to making this kind of process so counterintuitive, and why it just doesn't register for some people that having a fixed rigid hierarchy of norms that are top down. By the way, that's the problem of a priori emanation, which we talked about right at the beginning, but why having that is in fact a threat to the open-ended genesis of novel norms or flexibility.
Right.
And it's, just to, again, throw in another thing and I'll shut up, but this is also the problem of adaptationism, right? And we can't, this is why the Dreyfus thing is inadequate. Like, we don't have to solve the problem because we're already attuned. Well, no, that's also what Weber and Varela try to say in that 2002 paper or whatever it is. It's like the structure of the organism already means that everything is disclosed in terms of a hierarchy of relevance. And it's like, no, there has to be a place for constitutive irrelevance, right? And you need that noisy deviation thing. That's the variation first, as I call it. You need that to be constantly penetrating in order for it to be grist for the mill of the production of novelty. So that's why Darwin is not an adaptationist, which is, the common misunderstanding of Darwinian, including by lots of biologists, right? Darwinian reasoning is that, well, whenever we look at any trait or character state of an organism, we can find we can explain its existence by virtue of adaptation. And it's like, well, no, not in an irreducible manner, not without an indivisible remainder. It is absolutely crucial to the Darwinian story that there is what Jay Gould, Stephen Jay Gould would call exaptation, right? But that things come into existence. This is existentialist in a sense, but in an arbitrary manner, and then they are grist for the mill of selection. So there has to be a certain amount of character states of any given organism at any given time that are excessive, that are that uncurtailable excess of freedom that you mentioned right at the beginning, that are anarchic in some sense, so that you can continually get novel things. And that, although I won't go into it now, is precisely the way abduction works for Peirce. Is that it is a kind of, if you don't know where to go, you just go. It's a spontaneous, seeking,
Yeah.
seeking and eliciting of feedback that then orients. It is not the a priori orientation of something, it's the establishment of an orientation, such that then you can basically do induction. Once you have an orientation, you can, and I'm sorry, I kind of am going into it, but there's much more to say. But, once you have that orientation, which is like a stipulated and contingent, genesis of a context, that's the genesis of a ground, right? But in a contingent manner, not in an a priori fixed from the beginning manner. It's a novel origin in a sense, like Simondon would say, an absolute origin. Because there's a way that it's a saltation, right? It's like a leap. Even though it's predicated on a shitload of inheritance, it's also a leap because it is not pre-statable in terms of the past. And then you go in inducing, then you explore the consequences of that novel ground.
What's neat about Peirce's account of abduction is that for him in the background there is this continuity or cynicism between mind and nature, which is, I think, significant here for the frame problem because, and this is where philosophy, I think, and metaphysics is always in the background of science, where Helmholtz is kind of taking the Kantian framework of mind with its a priori categories and physiologicalizing it or naturalizing it, let's just say, historicizing it so that these become priors and that the brain is in the business not of imposing these sort of eternally fixed categories as they seem to be in Kant, who just sort of lifts Aristotle's categories and doesn't explain their genesis. Although, Kant's on the verge of that account because he has a view of the epigenesis of mind drawing on the biology of his time. But nonetheless, it's, Helmholtz who really brings that more into conversation with physiology and in a way loses sight of what Kant meant by the transcendental, but has a kind of biological sense of the priors, as Bayes would call them, and but that's all downstream of this problem that Kant is inheriting from Descartes, which is this idea that the mind is somehow separate from the world and needs to create an internal model of it. Where did that idea come from? Heidegger says, Kant says there's a scandal in philosophy that no one's been able to prove the existence of the external world. And then Heidegger is like, no, the scandal is that you would even ask that question.
Yeah.
And so we need to swim back upstream, as it were, so we don't get into this issue with the internalist versus the externalist and like debates about representations. And I think that's already way downstream a particular metaphysical choice that's been made, right?
Right.
I think Peirce recognizes that and sees organisms and their environments as continuous with one another, such that you never have one without the other. There never was an organism that wasn't already constructing its niche. And you would think active inference is getting the sense that this isn't just about passively perceiving things, but predicting what your actions are going to do to the world and starting to break down that boundary. But I think there's still a lot of metaphysical residue there, inherited from this more or less Cartesian framework. And poor Descartes gets beat up all the time. But I think there are some major dilemmas that cognitive science finds itself saddled with that are not scientific problems, actually. They're metaphysical problems. And so you're never going to be able to solve them, by adding another term, to the equation or whatever. It's a deeper conceptual issue. Right. And
yes, and to give credit back to Dreyfus again, this is something that he was very acutely aware of, especially later in his career. There's a great book that he did with Charles Taylor called Retrieving Realism.
Yeah, I
in
love that book.
2015.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the first couple, like this divide that you're speaking of and the origins in Cartesianism is so lucidly pointed to there. And again, I got to give credit to someone like Mike Wheeler. Mike Wheeler talks about it at length in his 2005 book, Reconstructing the Cognitive World. So the heritage, the legacy that we have taken from Descartes, I think is well recognized in cognitive science. And the shackles are slowly coming off. The concern that the cognitivists would have is, again, well, once we get rid of that metaphysical divide that seems to be laying us down ultimately, what do we have left? What's the explanatory potency of our accounts when that sort of kind of intuitive distinction goes? And so people like Anthony Camara have written really nicely about this. You can actually still make tractable claims even with that kind of Cartesian image, perhaps not entirely dismantled such that you still want to say there's a kind of individual and their environment, but not so much. See, this is the interesting thing about Heidegger is actually how much does he dismantle that distinction? Arguably in Being and Time, it's still very Dasein-centric, whereas the later Heidegger, which becomes entirely disclosive and about the events, really gets to probably what he wanted in Being and Time. I don't think cognitive science can go all the way to the event, to the disclosed event, because they lose the kind of objective analysis that they find interesting, which is the autonomous individual acting on its environment, with which it is nevertheless coupled, with which in which it is embedded, and yet there is a still kind of asymmetry of agency there. An interesting thing that often comes up with the notion of an affordance, right? One thing I mentioned to Viveki years ago was we typically think that affordances, understood in the kind of Gibsonian sense as possibilities for action latent in the environment, are possibilities for things with cognitive or physical abilities, living things, so to say. So when I talk about the affordance that the climbing wall presents for me, I can only talk about that in terms of the climbing wall offering me an affordance. One question which lingers, which is, am I providing an affordance to the climbing wall to be a climbing wall, And then I think you get back into this kind of metaphysical question of, well, I've had these conversations with these kind of radical embodied cognitive scientists. Where I think the kind of rubber hits the road is whether or not they're willing to endorse a kind of asymmetry or symmetry, asymmetry or a symmetry within the environment, the agent environment arena. And I think most of them are still willing to invoke an asymmetry which has the kind of legacy of Cartesianism. So there's loads there. But
there's heaps there. I mean, to say something about this symmetry and asymmetry thing, and then bracket it, because maybe we'll come to that. Something you and I talked about a little bit on WhatsApp, Darius. But the problem for me is posing the like static and absolute asymmetry between organism and environment or something like that, saying that there's always a particular kind of asymmetry between those things, where in fact, to some degree, both of those things, but in particular, the environment is like a stipulated, thing that is only homogeneous at a particular level of like fairly extreme abstraction. It can itself, of course, always be, decomposed essentially indefinitely. And the degree, like where the influences are coming from in terms of who is informing who, I mean, it's always reciprocal to some degree, but the asymmetries are going to be different for every sub-relationship that you can decompose in that sort of very coarsely described as organism-environment relationship. Just give Darius a second.
What happens when room get double booked? Give me, I'll be back on the Zoom in 2 minutes. I need to go downstairs. Sorry.
All right, we'll pause it. Yeah, all good.
That's frustrating.
Yeah, no, he should have stayed at home. Yeah, I mean, where I hope we can get to. I mean, there's just so many things. Like one of the things I think that in activism importantly gets right, in a sense, right? But you mentioned it already. but it's not original to enactivism, obviously, but is niche constructionism. And that has to be talked about in this context, because it's not obviously that an organism is encountering a preformed environment and then, working out what's relevant in it. The other thing that's really important, and I've talked to Darius about this, which I'd love us to talk about though, is that it's not that we don't solve the frame problem is not a problem for us in the Dreyfus kind of sense, but it's that we're not actually as miraculously good at solving it as this framing makes it out to be. It's like even the way Darius talks in the paper, we mostly get it. There isn't a universal yardstick for error. Error itself is only definable in relation to a frame, right? But
and if we didn't make errors that weren't, they didn't get us killed, we wouldn't learn
yeah,
anything. So it's
exactly.
important. It's important to make errors.
Exactly. So we're always fucking it up, basically, as far as like, and no, more so in our history than now when we're chronically distracted and not attending to what might be most relevant according to some relatively objective yardstick. But yeah, we're lucky in that, those of us that are this lucky, we're not in a war zone, we're not in a life or death situation where we've got running water, all of that. So we don't have that imperative. So Darius, while you were away, I was saying a couple of things that I think we could get to without wanting to like pre-state the direction of the conversation is
Sure.
that what enactivism does get right, but again, it's a more generic thesis than that, which is the niche constructionist aspect here. That the environment really shouldn't be conceptualized as pre-existing the organism's, presence within it. Like Simondon is very good on this, right? Like the subject and the milieu are always correlative terms. And they're both individuating, but a novel individuation is a novel arrangement of those two things, right? It's not just a new individual appearing in a static environment and then making different judgments about relevance or whatever. It's actually a constitutive interdependency. I mean, the Buddhists are pretty good on that. And then the other thing is, which we did talk about as well, I mean, error is not the right term. Error is a shorthand term. Error is not the right term because I was just saying to Matt, and he was agreeing, there isn't a universal yardstick against which we can say what is right, what is really relevant and what isn't. But there are ways that we can approach that to different degrees. Sometimes there are relatively objective judgments. Sometimes they're incredibly quote unquote subjective or arbitrary, our judgments. But we deviate all the time, basically, like we are imprecise. Basically, we're subject to distraction. And we are lucky because we're not in war zones and we have running water and all of these things that, most of our like mistakes are not really punished. But organisms in general fuck this up all the time, right? And if they didn't, they wouldn't be subject to like predation by ambush hunters or, all kinds of stuff. This is why ultimately this is a selection problem, by the way. But, one of the very coarse manifestations of that selection is if you don't attend to the relevant signals when there's a tiger in the long grass, you get eaten, but that happens all the time. So it's not that organisms are these incredibly virtuosic resolvers of the frame problem. They're in a constant situation of having to try and resolve it, but the problematic of the situation is never resolved once and for all. It's always ongoing. And sometimes, they make such a big mistake, they attend to the wrong thing. And that's why, mimicry exists. That's why camouflage, all of these things that organisms do that are exploits for the fact that that their target organisms say are not the virtuosic solvers of the frame problem that I think sometimes the much more abstract AI/cognitive science literature. And on the critical side, like it's the people saying, look, organisms can do this thing that AI can't do. Often in that discussion, it makes organisms sound like miraculous, infallible solvers of the frame problem. And it's like, no, we're like stumbling around in the dark and like tripping over and hoping it's not, going to kill us. But this is very connected to abduction again, because abduction is about stumbling around in the dark.
Yeah, and just like first with abduction, Whitehead really thematizes error as the source of novelty in evolution.
Yeah.
He says,
go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead. I'm getting enthusiastic.
Tim knows this line, but Whitehead has this whole theory of propositions that has nothing to do with, logical judgments or sentences or
Mm,
anything. It's more like a proposition as a lure for feeling that an organism can um, take account of to compare what's actually the case in its perceptual field with what it could do via action or an alternative that it could realize in the next moment. And so Whitehead says that it's more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true, because, false propositions or would allow an organism to introduce some novel behavior that it hasn't yet, seen in it hasn't engaged in its environment. And so error error minimization seems to me like it sometimes, if that's what we're optimizing for, it misses a lot of what's driving learning and creativity in the natural world.
right. So yeah, so there's so much to say here. So the first thing I will say is that I am, as heretofore, reticent to say whether we are outside of frames of relevance. It's an ongoing discussion. There are, one thing that comes, I think, of coming out of the Heideggerian way of thinking and the Dreyfusian way of thinking, is that Heidegger, in speaking about Dasein, implies, I think, that the essential mode of Dasein is still a kind of understanding. Now, that can be shaken up in moments of anxiety, although even then there's an understanding that you're still pure potentiality, you're still pure projection into a kind of open-ended future. But typically when people use the Heideggerian framework to talk about relevance realization, they appeal to the three modes of the ready to hand, the unready to hand, and the present at hand. And I think when we're talking about stumbling around in the dark, finding our way, Heidegger could still well explicate this, and so could Dreyfus, in terms of perhaps the unready to hand, or at moments a kind of very detached present at hand. And yet that would still be our kind of overarching goal, is to come to a better epistemic grip, a better optimal grip, as Merleau-Ponty would put it, with our environment. So this notion that optimizing I think there's a lot to say here also about error, but I think there's an interesting question about even when we are being erroneous with respect to a quote unquote objective standard of relevance, whether we are not achieving or resolving the relevance problem in some way, even if what we have to do is just forage randomly, get the ball rolling in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, we're always subject to frames of relevance, and in fact, many frames of relevance, they proliferate in the manner of novel norms in biology. But the question that you're asking in the Heideggerian slash Dreyfusian, framework that you're invoking there, you'd have to convince me that that isn't subject to the same kind of problem that you're accusing the free energy principle or the active inference of being subject to, which is that there's the implication that there's always a deepest frame, or there's always a primary frame that is always like everything else. Maybe there's proliferation of novelty, but it's always going on inside that deepest thing. So you're saying there's always the goal of a more optimal grip or something like that, but nonetheless, there's stumbling around and everything within that. Now you're just in the synergetics effective theory landscape, as far as I'm concerned, right? You're saying that all novel proliferation is still subject to some overarching first prior in the terms of literature. And that's the problem for me that we're trying to get away from.
No, sure. I think what I would say there is that what we prioritize, what constrains us, I think for someone like Heidegger, would be the contingent. It wouldn't be some overarching frame. It would be, given the situation you're in that's now disclosed to you, and given the mood you're in, the stimmung, given the way that you've been thrown into the world, given your background past, there are paths available to you and paths that aren't. But that isn't due to some overarching universal principle. It's due to what you have been and where you're going, given your idiosyncratic 100%. Particular projects. So the notion that you could still, I think Heidegger would still want to say, relevance is very much still disclosed to us, even in the kind of present at hand moments. It's just not done so by way of a kind of universal first prior.
Yeah.
I think he gets that. And in part, I think he gets that because of how much he forefronts temporality, right? Where temporality is the basis of Dasein, the threefold originally temporality. So I really like William Blattner on this. I know people have problems with Blattner or have concerns about his framework, but the way in his book he talks about Heidegger's threefold originally temporality as the basis of care, as the basis of Dasein structure, I think, and we're getting slightly away from the relevance problem here, I think because that is in some ways, kind of the fundamental moving force for Dasein, for being there, is the threefold, always unified, yet, like in this way, distinct forms of temporality, projecting into a past projecting into a future that is constrained by your past. That these contingent structures of constraints can pop up because, like, it's ultimately all geared towards you're just moving along these tides of temporality, right? And these little, they're not overarching skyhooks. It's probably similar to the kind of evolutionary story where you get contingent constraints.
Yes, yeah, but just to quickly intervene, I totally agree, and I think that's a great framing, and this is what Rainer Sherman takes from Heidegger and makes into his thesis on ontological anarchy, right?
Right.
But the key thing, it remains, this is the Darwinian intervention, and of course, most subsequent thinkers are to some degree influenced by this as well. And again, it's not fully original to Darwin, but there is a spontaneity, like the actual particulars, the firstness in Peirce's terms of that stumbling in the dark is orthogonal to any goal, right? So it's not it's not that it can't be selected, and in some it can be selected, and then it will be assimilated to some other goal. But the actual particulars, and Matt knows, and everybody knows if they've watched my videos, I gesticulate wildly, and then I say, "Look," and I'm doing this spontaneously. That spontaneous activity, which of course is not abjectly random, but of course in other frames is also constrained, right? Of course, by like the laws of physics and it's actual and constrained. Of course, it's not some sort of pure abstract notion of pure spontaneity, but it is not always already canalized by the frame that it will become referent to via selection. And that's the key point. That's why it's excess, because with regard to the specific, telos that it is going to become, in service of, in some sense, it is not always already in service of that. And that's the key distinction, I think. And that's why, so when we're stumbling around in the dark, yeah, of course, like the hope is that we're going to get oriented, but the specifics of our stumbling are not oriented, and that is that is the point. Yeah.
Good. So I actually think active inference can happily accommodate this.
No,
and Carl would
it definitely can't. It will say that it can. It will say that it can, but in terms, it can't in the way that synergetics, with its phase of random movement between attractors, cannot, because what it doesn't have, sorry to interrupt, but what it doesn't have is the way that the novel attractors are constituted from the stumbling. So kind of the way that I was saying it made it sound like, oh, well, we're going to get canalized by a pre-existent attractor. And of course that happens a lot, but the point is that the genesis of the attractor landscape itself, so all the norms, is also from the process of stumbling. This is why it's firstness first or variation first or whatever. The norms have to emerge. This becomes a difficult metaphysical thesis because it goes straight to the base of all of these issues and confronts us with the limit of thought, the limit of rationalization. And Whitehead knows this, right? This is why Whitehead's posit of the primordial nature is absolutely irrational. We all know there are reasons why I don't like that way of dealing with it, but you're hitting a limit here, and again, that's why we need to tell the abduction story in more detail, and we need to abstract it. It is abstract then to the metaphysical level, recognizing the limits of that process, and then oscillate between that most abstract level and the actual, always already embedded organismal problem solving whatever level, because to the point that I think is central here, the cognitive scientists may well feel, as you were saying earlier, Darius, that they don't need to do the metaphysics, that they can just get on with, and that's true. But the thing is that doing the metaphysics actually changes the way you do the cognitive science in precisely the way that you're concerned about, because it recovers that flexibility of the organism to not always already be subject to the deeper or deepest frame. And so why I say that active inference can't do it, or the free energy principle can't do it, is because it presumes the frame. The frame is always postulated, not generated, which is the case for all physical theory in some sense, right?
Mm. Yeah.
In part, it's going to be predicated on what you call active inference. And I don't think we need to go into that kind of thing. I mean, I agree. There's a very interesting dynamic of what's happening with the free energy principle more broadly, and the turn away from the non-equilibrium steady state, which Kate Nave has spoken about in her book, and I've written about in well, hopefully in places that will come out that you've read, Tim. Because and I think this comes into your notion of the limits of thought, or the limits of explanation. Ultimately, what your explanatory scheme ends up giving you is mere description, mere recapitulation of whatever's happened in terms of some kind of Bayesian scheme. So just to kind of like give the overview for the listener, and both of you, I guess, as well, if it's not kind of clear what I'm talking about. I think that there's good, textual evidence. And also I think that philosophers and cognitive scientists need to get better at doing textual exegesis, because like careful reading is really, really useful. And that you actually get from doing a literature degree. Imagine that.
Useful and ethical.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, like you may as well, you know, steel man your opponents and really like try and take them at their word. But I think through kind of careful textual analysis, there has undoubtedly been an overemphasis on homeostasis, biological self-regulation within active inference. And this is in part because of the ground of active inference is the free energy principle, which is essentially a sort of elaboration of the idea that we minimize entropy. So Carl's move here is to say, if you read his 2010 Nature paper, he goes from Schrodinger, okay, we're the things that minimize entropy, we're neg-entropic things. We can't have, the long-term average of that is this thing called surprisal, which is the negative log probability of an observation given your generative model, or Shannon self-information. We can't access how surprising our observations are, and so we need to up a bounds. But fortunately, there's this tractable thing that we can track called variational free energy, which bounds surprisal. And basically, the two terms that are associated with the variational free energy, which we can get into if we want to, they end up associating, and that's a really interesting move that's done here, with perception and action. Perception is minimizing the KL divergence between your like posterior, the recognition density as it's called, and the true posterior. And then action is, okay, so you've now got like a good veridical account of the world. I know Tim's got a problem with that word, but like you've got a good approximate thing of what's going on in the world, and then you want to make it conform to your preferences. And that's maximizing the observations of your preferences. But because it's come out of the essential notion of entropy minimization, there's been an excessive emphasis on homeostasis as the driving core of organismic life, such that you read people like Axel Constant puts it very well in one of his papers, where he says, in active inference, survival and life seem synonymous. Cool. Then noticing that this is a problem because we do things that are quintessentially anti-homeostatic, right? Not even just anti-homeostatic, just like irrelevant to our homeostatic requirements. What has been a move in active inference is to say, well, let's ditch the non-equilibrium steady state. We don't have to do these kinds of itinerant returns to a most likely attractor space given the type of generative model that we are. Rather, what we can do is we can observe the creature over time and their transformations, even to the point where they die or commit suicide or whatever it is, and we can cash out that entire path as a path integral of free energy minimization. Yeah. So this is recent work by Carl and people like Maxwell Ramstead, and actually prefigured by a very interesting paper by Andy Clark in 2017, where he talks really about sort of metamorphizing Markov blankets. Kate Nave's point is then, okay, so you can now explain any process, any temporal span of time in terms of the dynamics of free energy minimization. Okay, so what? Like, so I can now describe the agent that kills themselves as optimizing the free energy of a environment ultimately where they become, one with the dust or whatever. And this comes into, last thing I'll say is this comes to Matt's point about what's the role of science. What the kind of homeostatic core gave, in my opinion, the active inference theorist, was a source of normative explanation. It said, this is what we predict and also predictive value, and we can talk about how those could come apart. This is what agents do. They survive. And if they don't, they've gone wrong. There's error, right? As you were talking about, the importance of error. Because they've had to abandon that kind of normative ground because it's overly constraining, they've ended up in explanatory vacuity. They just end up not making any explanations. And so again, there's another interesting trade-off between trying to explain everything by way of one ground norm to explanatory vacuity. And I think the ultimate reason for this, last thing I'll say, is it's because they try and explain everything without a recourse to explanatory pluralism. And if they could just endorse other people, social psychologists, evolutionary biologists also can contribute resources, data, information, then they wouldn't fall into these problems. So this is the quintessential problem with the grand unifying theory. And I can get into what I mean with all this, but that's just laying out the kind of what I see as the arc that active inference has taken and why all of these complaints keep reiterating.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Darius, and really quick, and then hand it over to Matt. And I think, where you were taking us with grand unified theory and the difference between explanation and description and all that is an important place to go. Although I think we can still tell the abduction story in more detail. But I think Matt will agree that in our conversations about active inference and the free energy principle, that I followed closely that transition towards the path-dependent formulation, and I've given that whole crew so much credit actually for reformulating their approach in light of salient criticisms. So 100%, like it's a vibrant research program actually, and I have a lot of respect for what they've done there. And in many ways, I'd say that helps them to score more strongly than some other, supposedly competitor programs in cognitive science and theoretical biology. So I'm totally with that. I think it remains predicated on the kind of on the stipulation of identity, basically. So either way, what you're saying is that this thing is this thing, and I will decide what properties it must have in order to be this thing. And so long as it remains this thing, it must do this. It must minimize free energy, essentially, right? And so the path-dependent formulation is still saying that this thing is this thing until it's not this thing, essentially. But so it's all predicated on a stipulated identification, which is much the same as autopoiesis and a lot of it. Like one of the major issues with the early, and I think probably all, but work on autopoiesis, like Barella and Maturano's original book, is that the whole thing is an identity theory, but they never really talk about how. So it's an effective theory in the sense that it's predicated on the identification of a basis of reduction, which they call identity, that which is going to be maintained by this system. But they never tell us how they do that coarse graining. They never tell us how they make that kind of reduction. That's essentially that's the problem with effective theory in general, is that there isn't usually a proper genetic account of how we derive the basis of reduction. What we actually do, because we're empiricists, in fact, is we look at the world and we're like, that looks like a thing to me, Yeah. So once I stipulatively say this is a thing, now I can draw a circle around it and talk about the conditions of it maintaining that thingness, right? This is the sense in which the free energy principle is like an incredible formal tool for systems identification, right?
Right.
Someone you spoke to, Jeff Beck, and partly because he's a diehard instrumentalist, he is one of the most lucid, and I think that's the way, Maxwell and Carl and they've gone, right? They've become more and more instrumentalists. And that's a biting the bullet. Like what this is an incredibly powerful tool for systems identification. And once it enables you to formally delineate the requirements for the maintenance of identity, but you're stipulating the identity. And what we're concerned about here with the frame problem, like the free energy principle is the ultimate, I don't know, one of the great formal tools for framing things. But the frame problem is the question of how organisms do it. Yeah, but this is why I call the free energy principle an effective theory of effective theorization, which is just cribbing off, that Bayesian mechanics paper, a map of that part of the universe, which appears though it's mapping or whatever, and I think that's right. I think that's really right. But what we want to talk about in a kind of, metaphysical process relational register and a Darwinian register is what is the actual genesis of frames, norms, identities, etc., immanently in the world that isn't, predicated on the existence of a observer or theoretician that externalizes themselves and imposes frames on that world, or just reads them directly off the appearances, because that's just what God does, in some sense, right? The programmer, the theoretician. I mean, that's a little bit funny to say that God is a theoretician given the etymological origins of theory, but anyway, so this is why I say it actually doesn't solve the problem. Like, it does an amazing thing. Like, it's awesome, but it's already at that point where we're taking frames for granted. We've now got a way of formally defining the frame in a beautiful way, and we can say, like, for this frame to be maintained, it must do X. Cool, awesome, but that's not. I don't like this formulation of solving the frame problem, by the way, like that, solving the frame problem. But yeah, the problems that we are discussing, I think, in this context still remain and are not solved by that. And all that's required in some sense is to say that the variational, well, not variational in terms of the variational calculus, right? But all these terms like noise, etc., they are always correlative to signal or to some, ground. Like, the variational calculus is about converging on something that is preordained, by the theoretician. But is saying that variation term, or indeterminacy, actually, indefiniteness, is what comes before this, and then we need an account of the immanent genesis of definiteness of framing. And yes, I know Whitehead has a different conception of definiteness and determinacy, which Matt can get into, but I'm saying definiteness pointedly. The immanent genesis of that is the problem. As I see it, that's the real generic problem. And that's the problem that I think people like Darwin, unbeknownst to himself, but Simondon in particular, and also Whitehead in his way, and Peirce, and and the theory of abduction, which we might get to, that's what they're really directly attendant to. So whilst the free energy principle maybe does represent some kind of peak formalism for framing, someone like Whitehead, who has his own not dissimilar solution to the frame problem, represents the pinnacle of exploring the philosophical consequences of the frame problem in some sense, right? At that most generic metaphysical level. Again, I don't like the way that he solves it, but he understood it incredibly deeply. And I think that's what's been lacking. And I think that's the concern. I think that's your concern in that literature. It's not that cognitive scientists need to worry about this stuff, but it will change what they do and change if you don't just posit the autonomous organism, but you have an account of its genesis, and thus you relativize it and its autonomy. Like, there's no absolute autonomy, right? Like, there's no autopoiesis in literal terms. It's all sympoiesis, blah, 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 or autonomy, to, take the term from recent movement in cognitive science. When you subtly but almost diametrically change things in the base of the theory, it does change what happens in those higher level process theories, and these problems of flexibility and stuff therefore don't come up in the same way. And that's why I think, if cognitive science wants to be more like biology, well, biology has been, especially since 1859, specifically concerned with this problem. We don't call it the frame problem. You can call it the origin of species if you want, but it's the same issue. And Darwin gives us this different schema, which isn't predicated on the pre-existence of the invariant that the variation is always going to be assimilated to, but is an attempt at giving an account, subsequently generalized by a few very lucid philosophers, of the genesis of invariance from variation. And to go all the way back to the beginning, just to poke Matt, Matt knows I have an answer to this. Oh, well, that just makes change, a novel invariant thing. There are reasons, but they're incredibly abstruse. Why that's not the case. But that would be, that would be probably too esoteric or too, difficult to get into right now. Anyway.
I wanna put my Heidegger hat on for a second because we've been talking so much about the frame problem, but we haven't mentioned Heidegger's sense of Gestell and framing, and his quip at the end of his life in an interview about how philosophy was just becoming cybernetics as an example of this technological enframing and the obscuration of disclosure, the disclosure of being, and that this we've in a sense been defending metaphysics. Actually, this might be a good time to share this comic. We've been defending metaphysics as doing more or less something like this. This was a little comic that Philip Goff shared.
That's good.
That upset some analytic philosophers of science.
That's fun.
But of course, Heidegger has this deep critique of Western metaphysics as leading to this form of technological enframing, and we're more or less dealing in all of the cognitive sciences and the computationalist forms of it, of forms of cybernetics, and I wonder about the deeper. It's not just the metaphysical wrong turns that may have been made somewhere along the line, and Heidegger goes back to Plato, though I think a deeper reading of Plato, as Tim knows, might absolve him of being guilty of all the things that Heidegger says he is guilty of. But I think it's not just the metaphysical question, it's the ethical questions here. And Marvin Minsky, when he came to University of Central Florida, it must have been 2005 or 2006. And I got to ask him some questions, and he had just finished presenting the thesis behind his book, The Emotion Machine. And he was quite convinced that, give me a few more years and, we're going to create the artificial intelligence that would be indistinguishable from, conscious animals, at least, if not human beings. Obviously, a lot of time has passed since then, and we're still having those debates. But I asked him, okay, let's say, just playing devil's advocate, you're able to create an emotion machine. Does it have rights? Do you pay it for its work? Does it get time off? And he treated me like I was an idiot for asking the question. He scoffed at me and he said, I'm a scientist. Like, ask a politician that question. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you don't think about that question? And I think that's exactly what Heidegger's talking about.
Right.
Problems of enframing. That you have a technological picture of the world as just a standing reserve, and not just the world, but human beings included in that world. That's just there to be manipulated. And it's thinking of how organisms navigate and make sense and realize relevance in their world in this cybernetic way that presupposes that all beings are in the business of trying to manipulate other beings. And this whole question that Heidegger was trying to point to of the disclosure of existence just gets elided, dismissed, like, oh, that's interesting for, when we smoke cigars or joints or whatever you want later. But the real science is not concerned with that sort of mysterious whatever question. And Heidegger doesn't make any sense anyway, so who cares, right? I think that's where my original question, about the manifest image and the scientific image is really coming from. But I hadn't ever thought of Heidegger's Gestell as relevant to the frame problem here, but it is indeed.
Well,
exactly
in framing, right? Yeah. No, I think one thing I would want to add to what you've just said, Matt, is that ultimately I think a lot of the issues that we're discussing here are about our relationship of alterity, otherness, the open other, the inconsumable other, right? This would be Heidegger's point of the standing reserve, is that we render everything consumable. And I think calculable and calculable to our ends, right? Like, how much free energy is this going to minimize if I eat this? And it's obscuring, and this might be Heidegger's point as well with the kind of fourfold constitution of the event. It's obscuring the fact that we, both in a diachronic and synchronic sense, and I think it's important to talk about both of those scales, because ontogenesis I take to be, because interestingly, the frame problem is typically a synchronic problem. How do I zero in right now on what's most relevant to me? But what I call the inflated problem of relevance, or the inflated frame problem, is incorporating the diachronic aspect of it, the ontogenetic aspect of it, as you guys would put it. But it's the idea that in both diachronic and synchronic settings, we are bound to otherness in not only what we become, but also in what we do. So I think part of the problem in this is rooted ultimately in cybernetics, but actually probably in, again, earlier robotics, is an internalism. It's like the siloed off individual who can make the non-influenced, non-constrained, rationalistic choice to do what they want to do, as if the potential for what that always was going to be was already bundled up within them. And to recognize instead that not only metaphysically, but as you say, ethically, the way of being is relational. It's that we are co-constituted in our activities and in our development by our relationship with others. We are nothing without the other, in a sense. So this also comes to my sort of more constructive approach to the frame problem, which I think, and also actually the philosophy of science question, which is that you need an openness to alterity. So in the same way that we need to be open to excess, to what's beyond us, in order for our actions to actually be intelligible, our sciences need to do that as well. So in the same way as the internal model is like the grand unifying theory of the self, the kind of notion of the free energy principle of predictive processing as the grand unifying theory, which is, and these are, I can get some quotes out if wanted, but, typically taken to be exhaustive and exclusive, it just collapses in on itself in terms of like ultimate vacuity, because I think it's ultimately lacking a kind of respect for the constitutive role of the other, whether that's the other sciences or the environment with which the agents they're describing are engaging. So I've kind of come to this conclusion that this isn't to solve the frame problem by any means, but the frame problem does not get off the ground as something that you could even get to grips with without realizing the coupling of you and the milieu that you're in, and what Tim was talking about earlier, the kind of co-constitutive relationships that I guess what Dewey, that the situation holds, as kind of Dewey would put it.
Yeah. Love. I mean, both of you, perfect interventions. Completely agree. I mean, obviously, a lot of my work has been about alterity, right? Chemical ecology. So my chemical ecological critique of autopoiesis and all of that. The critique of unity, the critique of unitarity. This is fundamental to the critique of effective theory, right? That everything is reducible to that and definable in terms of that one, ultimate frame. So I think this is exactly right. I'm going to read the Simondon quote again that I read last time Matt and I talked, because it's the Simondonian ethical quote. Which is really, I think, beautiful and just worth repeating anyway. So I'll read that in a minute. But yeah, I think bringing in Heidegger here, I never want to give Heidegger credit, but obviously, the dude was a very
not a good dude,
most ethical dude, but he has a point.
Yeah, but he was a very smart dude, and it's very clear to me, both, and Matt and I have gone over this heaps, and also Darius, we've gone over this, and this is part of the discussion with the paper we're doing on the Simondonian stuff in cognitive science. But this was a big part of the cybernetics reading group that with Marilyn, Jason Tuckwell, and Mads and Norma that we had last year. All of this stuff is very proximally all this stuff we're talking about, and it's funny the fights between enactivism and free energy principle and all of that. They're all deeply downstream of cybernetics. So they're all, and of course they've inherited in very different ways, but they're taking this sort of fundamental framing thing, which is always obscured. This is the obscuration of obfuscation of Genesis again. It's the taking the autonomous individual for granted as the given, and then going from there without thinking the problem of individuation in Simondonian terms. And I think Heidegger is, obviously Matt knows, I think Heidegger is absolutely right about this, although I prefer to just go to Rainer Sherman because, I like him, as a person much better. And, Sherman, ties this into, he was originally a priest, and he ties this into, his work on Meister Eckhart and all these things. Not that Heidegger doesn't go there, but yeah, I think Heidegger's absolutely right. And almost everybody takes this over to some, it's not original with Heidegger, but takes this over in the 20th century in the continental side of things from Heidegger to some degree. But they all want to, especially the French, of course, want to disavow a Heideggerian influence, many of them, for a lot of reasons. And then, of course, there are devils in the details, and there are things we might not want to, even without the whole Nazi thing, that we might not want to affirm about that philosophy. But this idea that cybernetics is the culmination of the main stem of Western rationalism, I would say, is absolutely correct, like correct diagnosis. And this is one of the reasons, to your point, Darius, about constitutive alterity, that I stand against all, forms of unity with a capital U, right? Like that everything is all part of, like, this is what I call the Spinozist fallacy, right? Not that Spinoza, again, I don't want to get into the Spinoza thing, not that there isn't a huge amount of incredibly worthwhile stuff in that philosophy, but the fundamental move that it all begins with is one that I just stand in opposition to. That's the particular antithesis, if you want, of the way that I'm approaching things. All the things, as I say, don't add up. All the little things don't add up to one big thing, right? Like alterity is a real thing. And what alterity really means is that there's an aspect of the other that is indeterminate or indefinite for us, right? That's what alterity is not subject to, not understandable in terms of logic that we're already in possession of, right? So this is also the whole thing about indefiniteness, indeterminacy, etc., being first in a sense, like being the generative source. But I always add, of course, this is the biological thesis, that alterity is very much, at least if we're thinking spatiotemporally as opposed to operationally, internal to organisms as well, right? This is the way that organisms for Simondon differ from physical systems, in that physical systems are at least capable of a kind of completion of individuation, like they become what they are and then they are inert, they're not continuing to individuate. There are lots of things to say about that, but the vital individual, as he says, maintains the charge of the pre-individual problematic within itself. I don't know, Matt watched it, I know, but, I just had a talk with Terence Deacon a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
All about this, but in way more biological, like directly biological terms. In terms of redundancy, relaxation of constraint, accumulation of variation. So all the stuff, like that's been my bread and butter in terms of like, obviously genetic mutation, but stochastic gene expression, all of that. These are all alterities that are internal spatiotemporally to the individual or to the lineage, because they're not subject to the prevailing kind of logic, if you want, of that lineage, but are the adjacent possible of that, in this Kaufman terms, that will be grist for the mill of the ongoing differentiation of that. Really important what you said about the synchronic and the diachronic, Darius. That's just the biological situation again, synchronic ecology, diachronic evolution, right? So there's no one without the other ever in like a real biological problematic. So yeah, I mean, the big issue that I have in Western philosophy, and I do think Whitehead is somewhat guilty of this, is the extrapolation of properties that are properties of a locus, of an individuated but also individuating individual, and then extrapolating them to a whole. And it's like saying that, the primordial nature is a god, like there is some ground of that kind, which we read off our experience, and then we project into a metaphysical principle. That's the error. I call it the Spinozist fallacy, notwithstanding all the differences between Whitehead and Spinoza, right? But this projection of what is appropriate to the definition of a locus, something that is framed or inframed, an individual, etc., to a whole. I'm like, you have no right to postulate the existence of that whole. That's a fiction. It is, and also because we know that the locus itself only exists at a degree of abstraction, which is not to say that it's not real. Like this is real, concrete abstraction or constitutive coarse graining, as I also call it, constructive coarse graining, all these little buzzy terms. But because again of that interpenetration of the spatiotemporal locus of the bounded individual by all this alterity, and of course, there's that new Reynolds paper on the holobiont and all of that, and how that's a challenge for autopoiesis. But this is just the generic biological problematic, again seen through the window of chemical ecology. I spoke a lot. Do you want me to read that Simondon quote now, or shall I shut up and read it later? It's just a nice one for the ethical dimension.
I want, maybe I could tee it up, because I think where Matt was going is interesting. I mean, it makes, especially out of the light of Heidegger. So I think you're right that later Heidegger has a grip on the concealed and the unconcealed more than he does in Being and Time, with an emphasis actually on the concealed. And maybe part of what we've been talking about is Western philosophy's tendency to bracket off the concealed as if it is of no import. Perhaps. And you see this in Merleau-Ponty with the flesh and the notion of excess in the flesh and the prepersonal and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But one thing the discussion of Heidegger and alterity makes me think of is Levinas, right? Ultimately, and perhaps what we're talking about here is the priority of the ethical over the ontological, whatever that means, right? And it may well take us to Murdoch, which is to be in a right relationship. That's actually a Vivekian way of speaking. Being in a right relationship with the other, which is a non-consumptive, respect for the excess compared to you that the other has, is a deeply Levinasian thing, right? And it's like that disclosure of true otherness is the real, right? Is the real. I think you see this again. I mean, it's not just in not even in the phenomenological tradition. You also see these two modes: the consumptive, the framing, the having mode, versus the dwelling, being. Right? That's Eric Fromm, right? To have or to be. So I think that polemic is also there. But the fact that it may have like an ethical undertone is interesting because it also implies a deep connection between our ethics and our metaphysics. And so that Levinasian claim becomes, quite robust, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the biological otherness that Tim was pointing to is very important, and it's a big part of, your critique of autopoiesis. But I think even what's interesting is even the self is already an other to itself. The I, in relation to itself, there's a gap there. There's an otherness internal to our own self-relation. And even though Heidegger is critical of the whole Western metaphysical tradition, if you look at the German idealists, much, and he credits them and inherits something from them. But even Fichte recognizes this with the not I.
Right.
Schelling has this with this notion of, he's a proto-existentialist. There's something unprethinkable about the sheer fact that anything at all exists. And the very notion of a dialectic implies this inner conversation with oneself whereby one can become another to oneself. And even Hegel, while he does seem at the end of the day to subsume everything back into the absolute or into spirit, which is sort of like self writ large. Even there, though, when he's talking about touch, he recognizes in touch, at least the phenomenology of touch, that we're encountering something truly other to mind or spirit. This is an interesting moment. I was just reading his his encyclopedia on subjective spirit, and I was like, oh wow, so even Hegel is acknowledging this irresolvable otherness, internal to the self, right? So it's biological, it's psychological, it's there in the tradition. It just doesn't get highlighted. I think Levinas obviously foregrounds that. And I don't know that I would go so far as to say ethics is first philosophy. I guess it depends on the conversation we're having. I don't, we've been talking about metaphysics this whole time before we remembered that Heidegger has such this deep critique of it. But I think, not all metaphysics is onto-theological.
Sure.
Not all metaphysics is in the business of treating God as a being that is the highest being that has dominance over all the others. And even I think Whitehead's theology is not onto theology, but Tim keeps poking me to get more into Whitehead, but I think it's just such a we need to do a different conversation about that to look at how he addresses the frame problem writ large.
Mm.
Because I can see
I'm only poking you because I was anticipating that you would go there and tell us that Whitehead had already solved all these problems. But
yeah, well, I like Deleuze's reading of and Bergson's, before Deleuze's reading of philosophy. It's more about creating new problems than it is about
yeah.
solving any problems. I'll leave
Well,
the problem solving to the scientists.
Well, and Murdoch says, philosophy is about making the obvious unobvious. It's
oh yeah, yeah.
it's
Problematizing. It's critical. It's
yeah.
problematizing. It's wounding thought, as Deleuze would say. And this is again
Right.
to bring Rainer Sherman in. He has this concern, and Matt and I did an episode on a paper where he brings this up, but about the philosopher as civil servant. And I think, so you get these, like, you get Laruelle and non-philosophy. You get this idea that psychoanalysis is anti-philosophy. But to me, that all just seems like it's a mischaracterization of what philosophy really is, because philosophy really is that process of always problematizing. And that's why I say speculative philosophy is the critical minimization of the speculative fictions. But it is a critical practice fundamentally, right?
And again, back to Murdoch, the significant question to ask a philosopher is, what do you fear? What are you afraid of? Philosophy, like that kind of relationship of the philosopher to their world which can be constitutive of love and fear and respect, and like that inframes their philosophizing as it does all of us. I like William James on this, right? It's like, there's a kind of, that's just your vibe. I know that's kind of mean on James's pragmatism, but he's like, like these questions, did God create the universe? Did God not? Well, like, that's kind of up for grabs. Like, whatever your vibe is. And that's all about your relationship with alterity. And so it doesn't surprise me that we're talking a little bit about the other day, Dreyfus has like a 10-hour reading of Moby Dick. And apparently, so my friend Tom has been listening to it because he loves Moby Dick. And he says that, there are points where you hear the audience like ask a question. And Dreyfus does this thing where he goes, well, maybe I've been wrong for the last 50 years. And like, yeah, sure, like that could be true. And my friend Jeff Yoshimi, who is a excellent Husserlian phenomenologist, was trained under both under Searle and Dreyfus. And he says there's a kind of similar, like Dreyfus would walk around the auditorium and be very happy to be corrected, to be shown a different way of seeing things, where apparently Searle, and I guess he's dead so I can say this, both are dead, and I don't think Jeff would be too annoyed about me saying this, was a little bit more dogmatic. And at least when I was first taught philosophy, it was all about releasing your dogma. It was all about a kind of openness to what you don't know, what could be otherwise, and so on and so forth. So it's the same thing circling around.
Yeah, it easily flips though, doesn't it? I mean, like, Popper and his thoroughgoing fallibilism, it's a sort of a universal acid type philosophy, but supposedly the dude was like incredibly dogmatic on the personal level, right?
Right.
Become a dogmatic skeptic and all that too. I mean, this question, I love the Murdoch thing. What are you afraid of? I've spoken about what is the apotropaic, so the warding off of evil, the warding off of threats, function of a lot of positive philosophy, maybe. But it goes back to your point there, Darius, about bracketing of the concealed. I'd say it's more like it's the concealed decision about what to conceal. All right, so different philosophers or different movements might differ on what to conceal, but it's then concealing that the thing has been concealed that is the big problem, which is basically, it's like denying that coarse graining is itself a genetic process, that there is a process of coarse graining that results in this abstraction in which the noise is taken out and concealed. And it's a big part, I think, of the story of modern philosophy, but we could say, obviously, it's pre-Socratic, blah, blah, blah. It's always been there, is the bringing back in of the noise. And this is, again, that Darwinian intervention, which is like, hang on, all that variation is in fact, and he's just deriving that from saying, like, look more closely at the appearances. You know, if you take only two beetles, you might be able to say species A and species B. But if you take 200 beetles that are, closely distributed with one another, you might see how they grade into one another. And in fact, every character state appears as if it's at least slightly variable. And two different systematists, two different taxonomizers, will draw the line between species A and species B differently. There'll be a bunch of individuals that one of them thinks is species A and the other one thinks is species B, because that coarse graining of the given, but of firstness, the firstness of variation itself, is a stipulative judgment. And it's basically the concealment of stipulation that is too much part of the story of Western philosophy. Not that there aren't all the counter theses as well, obviously, but there's this overriding, this goes into the question of, like, is the world intelligible in toto and all of that? And the answer is no.
Right, which was Plato's answer in the Timaeus originally. It is not
Well,
totally intelligible. Right?
yeah, and of course that I'm always bringing up, like, the Cora. I love the Cora, right? I do think that there is an assimilatory move in even the Timaeus, where Plato is saying, yes, this is necessary and it can't be completely assimilated, but it is like the thrust of the thing is towards assimilation. And then I think
Well,
if you look at,
I think he's not obscuring the otherness there, because he says the best we can do in cosmogony or cosmology is tell a likely story, right? He's not offering a final theory. He's offering a
yeah,
likely
yeah,
story.
he's definitely not trying to resolve the problematic by fiat, right? Which is the concern here. But yeah, I mean, sorry, go on.
Well,
I was just gonna. Sorry, go, Matt.
no, 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 please.
My point is
You don't
very
want
much.
Tim and I to get off on a Plato debate right now.
Well, just to bring in a bit of interesting neuroscience here about noise. I think I sent this to you, Tim. There's this growing. So there's this notion in neuroscience that decision making is done via a kind of accumulator model. You accumulate evidence for the decision you're going to make or the affordance that you're going to exploit. It reaches a threshold and then boom, you go. Right? Like, this is Chisek and Kalaska have done a lot of this kind of work on affordance competition. Now that kind of implies a reason or a motive rather for why you would make that decision, where your evidence base is coming from. Recent work, which is actually building off the kind of Benjamin Libet studies on free will, has argued that random fluctuations in neural activity for voluntary decision making is the driving force behind when you take voluntary decisions. So rather than having to rely on some, again, internal, rationalistic, detached Cartesian move, where you're like, I'm going to move now, and that's a decision that I made for myself. What is coming out of a lot of the neuroscience, this is their sort of leaky stochastic accumulator model, is that, like, when there's just like this kind of basic imperative to move, the precise moment in which you move is actually determined by these kind of sub-threshold, spontaneous, random fluctuations. So this is the work of people like Aaron Scherger. I think Stan DeHaan is on some of these papers. And it's a contrast to the slightly more deterministic view of, here are these robust reasons why you would take action in line with your preferences and goals. And then we can therefore predict in a very deterministic fashion when you're going to act in line with those most basic norms. So just to say that this notion of bringing back noise is really having a kind of renaissance in at least the brain sciences.
That seems to align with the phenomenology of flow states too, doesn't it? When you let go of the need to decide, or you plan in advance and you just enter into the activity.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems
we could go into we could spend a lot of time on that.
We could have a lot to say about that, but
we should definitely do that, and I would love to talk about improvisation and all that in the context. But just to say, I have one idea, and I just keep bringing it out. Yeah, of course, that story that you've just told beautifully, Darius, about the spontaneous brain activity and its sort of canalization, or I say elicitation, by a context, and also like passing a threshold. I mean, to be honest, that's just a standard selectionist story. That is the
Mm.
story of evolvability in molecular biology, especially if you get into the level like beyond neo-Darwinian reduction bases in point mutations of gene sequences, and you put in the layer of stochastic gene expression, then you've got exactly the same kind of dynamic. You've got essentially random. That term always needs scare quotes around it, but fluctuations that are grist for the mill of experience-dependent plasticity, right? So that there will be a selection from a environment, again, broadly speaking, that will say, this is what you need to be right now. This is the subset of, to go a little bit Heideggerian standing variation, but of all of this variation that you are maintaining, neutral variation essentially, that is aligned with what is the appropriate next phenotype, from the level of behavior all the way down or up or whatever, enabling you to have a context appropriate response to an unprestatable variation in your environment, basically. So that's again this twin alterities, right? And so yeah, spontaneous brain activity is to me a classic example of that, and it's not even like materially physically unrelated to stochastic gene expression. So yeah, no, I love that story. It is exactly the same kind of thing, which is again why I think the discussion of abduction is really relevant here, and the thinking of the frame problem, like how we reframe things or how we orient in an ongoing manner, is a selection problem. It's the way that spontaneity encounters context, but then constitutes novel context as a result of that encounter. So it's not, again, that there's a pre-existing environment that solicits. I prefer this elicitation thing because I think it's both reciprocal, but also there's still room for that, what you were calling the more deterministic story about actual decisions.
Yeah.
Because actual decisions
So
are.
I think you can get, just to very quickly flag, I think you can get that with solicitation in the way that I use the word, in the way that I use solicitation. But I can talk about what I mean by that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and we should. I just prefer the connotation of
Sure.
because it makes it seem less like a forced move, right? It's like there are, in fact, various alternatives, and sometimes there is a capacity for a kind of higher order choice to be made, and often there's no incentive to make a higher order choice. So we are just kind of like, drifting, and that again comes into the realm of a sort of kind of nearly neutral variation, which is a major story in molecular evolution of the past since 1970 kind of. But it's even even going back further, it's a Waddingtonian story about accumulation of neutral variation, which is still similarly, sort of stably canalized by an epigenetic landscape, by the creods. And, Matt will tell us that there's a Whiteheadian influence there, which there is. But then there's a moment of elicitation or solicitation or whatever, entering into a novel context, and a threshold is crossed where some of that formally neutral variation needs to be, brought to bear on the genesis of a novel behavioral or whatever phenotype that it can respond appropriately to this novel challenge, and the epigenetic landscape reorganizes. And you actually do see, I mean, this is a story about developmental biology for Waddington, or for Richard Goldschmidt and his Hopeful Monsters. You actually see a kind of saltatory thing happen there where a quite novel phenotype emerges out of development. But I think a more contemporary position is just that development is always ongoing. That's experience-dependent plasticity, right? And there are peaks and troughs of it throughout our lifestyle. But I was just reading an article the other day about neuroplasticity beyond 60, and how all these people are able to develop from baselines that they had at the age of 60 at the beginning of the study, given certain practices and mindsets and blah blah blah. So in some sense, that problematic of individuation in the Simondonian sense is indeed open-ended, depending on the kind of system you are and the amount of neutral variation you can sustain or maintain. And maybe the brain is the system that can sustain the most. And that's why, we're so creative and imaginative, and why we can enter into flow states and play instruments and do things that have never before been done and all that. It is going to be a story about that capacity for something to vary in a neutral manner, and then to be elicited. Just on the ethics thing super quickly, but just to say that, because we might get back to the Simondon quote at some point, whether ethics is first philosophy, I think what Simondon has this term axiontology. And he's not saying that ethics is first philosophy, but he's saying that there's always an ethical correlate to any ontology. So that once you're in a position where you're talking about being, so something has become, something has been generated, there are individuals and states and all that kind of stuff. There's an ethical correlate always to that thing that that the way you are conceptualizing being and becoming in their relationship there.
Yeah. I'm still thinking about the phenomenology of decision making and how when I make a deliberate decision where I've weighed all the pros and cons and whatnot, when I finally arrive at what I ought to
Yeah.
do, it actually feels quite determined, like not free at all.
This is Dennett's point. This is just to say, this is Dennett's point about determinism. This is why Dennett doesn't think, this is why Dennett's a compatibilist. He's like, you want determinism to be real, and you want your choices to be part of what determines an outcome.
Yeah, well, freedom is self-determination is how the tradition of idealists would always refer to it. But whereas when I feel in the flow, like when I feel like I'm giving a great lecture, yeah, I've read what we're studying together, and I'm prepared, and I'm an expert, hopefully, in what we're talking about. But a really good lecture to me feels like I surprised myself by something I said that I'd never quite formulated that way before, and it doesn't feel like even that I did it. I'm as surprised and delighted by what came out of my mouth as anyone else who's listening.
Yeah,
And so
because what is I?
that
What
feels
is the
more free than the deliberate like decision
yeah?
making.
Because the locus of identity, this is the point to some degree of the Murdoch paper, but of psychoanalysis, but of, the notion that any, jazz musician would talk about or would have come across, of a kind of ego dissolution in improvisation and all that. And of course, in some cases, people will make that an explicitly, religious, I'm channeling, but it's, what is the locus of identity? When you say, I didn't do that, this again, Dennett, Elbow Room, by the way, is a really good book. His first major book on free will from the 70s. But Dennett would caricature a lot of the incompatibilist, determinist, quote unquote, brain scientist by saying, my brain made me do it. And it's like, well, so when the ego is not involved, and I think what's going on here is that the ego is a coarse graining function, and it's a reflective function. It's a function. It's an identifying function that enables us to insert ourselves into social contexts with a kind of understanding of what kind of being we are and how we behave in those contexts. So it's linguistically mediated, all of that stuff, but it's not a locus of control. And like of what is it, like virtuosic coping or whatever. And when we get more and more stuck in our egos, more and more stuck in that's when we're second guessing ourselves, or when we say, I'm getting in my own way. Get out of your own way, man. Just kind of let it happen. And you practice heaps, and the ego is involved in, developing motivation and maintaining motivation and everything. But when it comes time to act, if the ego's in there trying to control the body, you're fucked because it can't, right? And this, you see people get paralyzed on cannabis and stuff like that because they're like, ego just expands. And they're like, I don't know how to pick up the glass of water. And I'm like, you've never known how to pick up the glass of water, just fucking up,
Yeah.
Yeah. It almost becomes more of the Freudian superego in those cases, like self-judgment and didn't Libet in the original papers on his experiment talk about, that this ego function, the prefrontal cortex perhaps is able to say no to the impulses.
Yeah. So that was where the freedom came from, is between the readiness potential and the action was the ability to say no. And that's a very McGill Christian thing as well, is saying no is a vital function. Like even saying no to no is kind of a form of saying yes. I've obviously written a lot about flow states, so this is very much my sort of wheelhouse. Interestingly, talking about, not, it wasn't me who did it. It happened through me. These kind of testimonies that one sees out of flow. My friend and colleague Tom Montefiore and I just released a paper literally this week in Synthese about flow states and creditability and agency. So given these kinds of testimonies, I wasn't really there. It's like, I didn't really seem to do that. How did that happen? Well, if you take those testimonies at face value, and then you take the Dreyfusian model, the late Dreyfusian model of the kind of philosophical zombie that is the flowing agent, where there's no noise, there's no awareness, there's no subject, there's no attention, there just is activity, there is disclosed activity. It becomes very difficult to point to a kind of locus of agency, skill, and therefore creditability. And so what we try to do in this paper is refute that kind of excessive Dreyfusian zombie view.
Yeah.
Because I think we also think that it misrepresents the phenomenology, where the phenomenology does not indicate complete phenomenal blindness. It indicates a loss of reflective self-awareness, which does not mean an inhibition of consciousness writ large. And so we wrote about this is the Frontiers paper that you guys discussed. We go we go into detail about the distinction between reflective self-awareness and so-called pre-reflective self-awareness, and we can talk about what that means, whether that's a robust phenomenon. But all of this to say that actually you can still have a intelligent, conscious, agentic, skillful performance in flow, despite the downregulation of your default mode network, your inability, the prohibitions on your capacity to plan, remember, self-scrutinize, as Tim was saying, and all the empirical evidence points to this, as does the manifest image. Get out your way, so the archetypal pole, pole that flow stands against is choking. Choking is excessive self-concern. And so, you're absolutely right there that and I want to make a story here about habits that maybe we get into, and that becomes very pragmatist, is that what is happening in flow is that you are getting out of the way of your deliberative mental time travel planning, mnemonic ways of thinking, and allowing your kind of skillful habits to come to the core, not in a kind of Rileyan single track deterministic fashion, but in a context sensitive, free fashion, ultimately. And I can talk about exactly what that looks like as a cognitive structure. All of this to say that everything you're saying regarding flow and its phenomenology is well corroborated by all the empirical work, plus the kind of theoretical work that I've been trying to do and others have been trying to do for the last couple of years.
Yeah,
so
I'm glad you're
get out your
trying
way.
to restore some sense of agency there, though, because I'm just recalling this. I don't know if you guys know who Mark Andreessen is. He's a big
yes, I saw the thing about he has no
the
introspection or something.
no introspection, right?
The
whole idea of an inner life was invented in the 17th century or whatever, and like we just need to get rid of that and just like exert our power on the world without second guessing ourselves. And there's some ethical implications for sure.
And there's a very classic and well characterized inflationary phenomenon of like toxic guruism that has been known and discussed in sort of like Vedic adjacent literature in India since the time before the Buddha. So it's like it's not. Yeah, we know that you can get into that state where you think you are, I don't know, operating as virtuosically as possible without any reflection. And I mean, psychopathy isn't that far away from that. And I mean, there are many, of course, 20th century examples that we can talk about, Osho and many other toxic gurus. But yeah, I mean, I think to amplify what you were saying, Darius, and just like totally agreeing, I'm really looking forward to reading the new flow paper because, we loved the last one, Matt and I did. And as you both know, it's a subject that's super dear to my heart as well from the music side of things. But I also think that improvisation, when I have my prosaic, speculative, and inquired schema, improvisation is the prosaic mode of engagement. So we do tend to mystify. It's like, oh, John Coltrane, he's able to entering into these states, and of course he was a ridiculously capable saxophone player. And so what he does with that state is very unusual, but it's no more, mystical even though it is mystical in some very proper sense, right? Like it is the foundation of mysticism in some sense, but it's no more, I don't know what the right term is then, mysterious or whatever. It's completely prosaic than just having a conversation, that we're all always improvising. And like, Merlin Sheldrake said to, when Matt and I discussed improvisation with him, he said, and this has stuck with me, it was a very lucid thing to say, if I stopped improvisation, you'd probably think I was dead or something like that, and it's like, yeah, that is, organisms are nothing if not spontaneous. We're always improvising. And again, this goes back to this excess, this not always already canalized, not always already pre-framed constitutive variation story in a really important way. But to amplify, what you said, Darius, it's not, that we can, skillfully cope or be virtuosic and intelligent despite the fact that we're not being reflective. It's precisely because we're not being reflective in those moments, right? Obviously, that's your point. But also, yes, it's absolutely not correlated with a diminishing of consciousness, but an opening and an expansion of awareness, right? Like when you go out and sit in the forest and try and do an open monitoring, Vipassana type meditation, you're not having an experience of like a diminishing of consciousness, quite the opposite. All of a sudden, I'm becoming aware of all of these things, and these patterns are emerging that I would, so noise is being turned into signal in some sense. And if you want to react really rapidly in the moment to what a bunch of other musicians are doing around you and whatever, I mean, obviously I'm just keep going back to the music examples, then you need to be to some degree in that kind of state. And if you're second guessing your fingers, I've said fuck far too many times in this conversation, but you're fucked, like you will trip up. And of course, the experience that I have, because I'm not John Coltrane, is that is happening all the time when I'm improvising. But I'm trying to minimize it. I'm trying to get out of my own way. More or less successfully.
Well, as you get in your own way when you meditate, of course, and the practice of Vipassanic meditation is recognizing when you've wandered. Right? It's not really about holding on to the breath or attention to the breath. It's paying attention to having wandered.
Exactly.
So there's so much to say here, because I love this kind of stuff. I mean, when you spoke about my paper, which again was very kind and very flattering, and I couldn't believe that there was a podcast talking about my work. The one point that did come out, which was very useful and interesting, was the slight concern about flow is that it's typically taken to be a highly constrained, entrained, what we would say like a pragmatic activity, in the sense that there isn't that much epistemic foraging, which would typically require a kind of mental time travel. You have practice in these kinds of domains over and over again, such that when you enter into them, your habitual, skillful sensory motor coordination can come to the fore. But that doesn't seem to kind of get it more or less in by being habitual, doesn't seem to open up one to the flexibility that one would have in improvisation. I think there are stories that one could tell here about, and I have tried to, in certain publications, talk about where some of this flexibility could come from. What I will say is that I think that this may in part be downstream of the issues we've been discussing today, which is starting with a kind of effective theory to discuss something like improvisation or creativity. I mean, this is also recognized by other active inference researchers. There's a paper by, which Carl is on actually, Axel Constant, Friston, and Andy Clark about predictive brains and creativity. So this was in Philosophical Transactions B. And they very much admittedly sense, I mean, I've got it in front of me here, there is a limit, there is indeed a limit. So they're talking about the dark room problem, which for people who don't know is, well, why would these agents who have these very constrained generative models not just stay in the dark room where their homeostatic preferences are just being affirmed the whole time? And the story there is obviously, well, we're not only interested in that, but then you get a relevance problem, which is, well, how come I at some point prioritize my homeostasis? Anyway. But they say, they kind of dismiss the dark room problem by saying, well, you can just have, you have a sort of expansive generative model that spans different spatio-temporal hierarchies. You have different preferences. And so when you're planning behavior over the long term, it actually makes sense to get out of the dark room given your expected free energy. But they say this, having said this, the intuition behind the DRP is not completely misplaced dark room problem. There is indeed a limit to how much behavior one can satisfactorily explain solely with skull-bound prediction and beliefs. Under PP, predictive processing, there is a sense in which all that one could ever perceive or predict ought to be already possible from the perspective of that person's world model or generative model. Changes in the content of our world models do not, it seems, involve the creation of brand new understanding so much as settling into a less visited or latent part of an existing space of hypotheses. And then they go on. And so what they call the enlightened room problem, which is kind of a more sophisticated version of the room problem, is the issue that, well, yeah, sure, the predictive processing agent can get out of the dark room, but it can only do so given the already prior equipment of them with beliefs that they should escape. And I think ultimately what we were running up against when we're talking about very pragmatic orientated aspects of flow, when you are playing the same piece that you practiced for 12 months in a row, is exactly that point, that you are just basically you are navigating a already well-formed generative model space. And that's an absolutely reasonable concern. There is a story to talk about with creative flow. I'm actually writing a chapter for a book, Cambridge University Press book, on creativity and altered states of cognition, and they wanted us to talk about creativity and flow states. The kind of ongoing empirical and theoretical tension between creativity and flow states is super interesting, because there is this phenomenon called creative flow, but the empirical evidence for it is sketchy. It's a bit ambiguous. Exactly, because I think people often are. There are reasons why I think it's sketchy. I'm not saying that creative flow is not a reliable or a genuine construct, but all of this to say that I take that critique seriously. I recognize it seriously, but it may just be downstream of beginning within a kind of effective theory.
Not beginning with spontaneity, right? Not taking the Darwinian lesson. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a totally different conversation, which I was actually supposed to have with Michael Evan this past week, but because my dog's been really sick and blah, 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 I've had to postpone it. But it's what I'm writing on and teaching on in this Acid Horizon Research Commons course about ontogenesis, and the the way that the discussion of jazz and improvisation has become a huge part of that. There's a really fertile discussion to have in this territory, and this is why I brought up that critique you're talking about in the last chat with Matt about flow, about different forms of musical practice, and the way constraint and spontaneity interact in different ways. I mean, there's far too much to say, and I won't get into it, but there's quite a big difference between a score-based composer as totalitarian dictator kind of situation, where an instrumentalist learns a ridiculously complex and difficult piece and then recites it, and they do go into a kind of flow state, obviously, and there is a small creative aspect to it, but largely their spontaneity is canalized by the spontaneity of the composer, in fact, by the intentions of the composer. And then talking about the ways different degrees of scoring interact with improvisation in different musical traditions. And I've always thought that there are heaps of really fertile analogies for different kinds of evolutionary process in there, but you would get the same thing in terms of different forms of flow, which are, operative in different musicking contexts. But I think that there is a spontaneity in what we're talking about, in that, the relaxation of the egoic constraint, as we were saying before, doesn't just mean we fall back onto all these pre-formed sensory motor constraints, doesn't simply mean that in a deterministic manner. It's just another, I mean, I'm not trivializing, but it's just another relaxation of constraint story, like the one that Terence Deacon calls inverse Darwinism, but that we were talking about in that chat. It's a certain layer of constraint has been removed. There are other constraints, sensory motor habits, practice still matters, but a certain degree of spontaneity is now able to flow through the canalization of those sensory motor habits, which would not have been able to do so if the ego was also applying its kind of quasi top-down constraint, right? So it's not a story about the complete, like never is in the kind of free will, etc., discussions, but it often gets binarized in this way of abject determinism or abject freedom, like there's all constraint or no constraint. It's different layers of constraint, right? This is totally relevant to the frame problem in terms of things like temporal hierarchies of constraint and all that, which we haven't got into, at the moment in this conversation, right? But there'd be heaps of stuff to say about the frame problem there. I mean, just to go back to that and to the musicking example, though, this idea that organisms like us don't, solve the frame problem, perfectly and virtuosically all the time. You can just talk about like listening to new music here. Like if I give you some music from a tradition that is sufficiently distant from the things that you are used to, your reaction might be, it probably won't be from either of you guys, but it has been historically from a lot of people. That's not even music. But we are subject to confusion in the encounter with novelty all the time because we don't have a frame for it. We're not just immediately solving the frame problem and being like, oh, I have this ready-made frame that can enable you to listen to whatever total serialism or free jazz or whatever you find, jarring. But you can experience the solving of the frame problem, which is the genesis of novel habits here, or the genesis of novel priors, if you want. You can experience that through habituation. I'm just going to listen to this piece until it makes sense to me.
I guess one of my concerns, if I can jump in, is a kind of discontinuity between, like, the idea that there's a discontinuity in understanding, like a radical binary discontinuity in understanding from when you hear the free jazz the first time and then when you hear it the 100th time. And why I think Heidegger is useful here is because I think what Heidegger is trying, well, maybe not Heidegger per se, but definitely some Heideggerian theorists, they often want to discuss, is there a hierarchy of priority or primordiality, I guess how they would describe it, with respect to the different levels of Heideggerian engagement, the present, the ready to hand, the unready to hand, and the present at hand. And it seems like Dreyfus, for example, definitely wants to privilege the ready to hand, right? And that would be your ability to play a piece without any reflective self-awareness. It would find its maximal form. And again, we do this kind of work in the new paper, exegetical work, of what he calls absorbed skill coping. And he would want to, I think, diminish what happens when you're confused. What happens when you start to take things as objects with quantitative features, right? Like I'm listening to this music, I'm like, it's this amount of length and it's these notes. And sometimes I have to do that kind of detached work. Dreyfus had a tendency, I would say, to diminish that form of understanding. And I use the word understanding in the very Heideggerian sense that is a form of understanding. That is a form of projection. That Dreyfus wants to diminish that and say that is a lesser form of understanding. That is us doing something worse or less valuable, or is not showing the human in their best light. They're not skillfully coupled to the environment. I like the move that's happening kind of neo Heideggerian thought to say, well, they're all forms of understanding. They're all forms of getting to grips with the world. And so that's why, again, I think the question is, do I ever think that we're outside the frame problem? If we demarcate the frame problem as, are we always skillfully coping with the world? Well, of course not, because the chair breaks, the hammer breaks, whatever Heideggerian example you want. And yet, and this I think is the deep Heideggerian point of what he calls background, what he calls Dasein, what Dreyfus calls background understanding, which is, or background coping, which is a deeper level for Dreyfus than skillful coping or being objective, being objective at the present at hand, is even when we're thrown in to complete confusion, we still kind of do what we need to do, even if that's just blind wandering. So this phenomenon, and this is the really critical phenomenon, I think, in Dreyfusian cognitive science of background coping, which for the predictive processing lot, they want to encode in an enormous generative model, and Dreyfus would find that repulsive, is the kind of critical thing here, and maybe is where the question of whether we are outside of the frame problem at any point comes to light, because I feel like I have a knack of saying, well, we are never absent a form of fundamental background coping, of familiarity, right? It may be fleshed out in certain forms when I'm playing a musical instrument and I'm in flow, I'm really feeling very confident and familiar. But this like kind of primordial familiarity that is just immanent to my being, I think is pretty much what Dreyfus is getting at with background coping. And then the question is, are we ever outside of that? And that's a very deep question that I don't think many people have asked.
Yeah.
There's a lot of redundancy between frames, right? Sorry, Matt, 2 seconds. There's a lot of redundancy between frames. It's like I've said before in discussions with Matt, all organisms are adapted to the environment that is a certain suite of ancient physical patterns that, radically predate life in the evolution of the universe. And so all organisms are going to be adapted to that. That's the broadest kind of niche. There is a redundancy amongst frames, right? But when you ask the question of like, are we outside the frame problem? You're already begging the question, because who's we, right? You're talking about like us as individuals. That means we're framed, right? Because what could it possibly mean to talk about an agent or an individual that wasn't framed? But the key issue that we want to bring up is the issue again of constitutive alterity. What is me and what isn't me? What is framed by my identity criteria and what isn't? And that's the key issue. So you're always going to be able to say, because we're like radically in medias res and blah blah blah, the universe is 14 billion years old. You're always going to be able to point to some frames. Like I said this in the discussion of your flow paper when we were critiquing Gallagher's paper on that, and he was like, no, there's this complete freedom, and I'm like, well, you look, there are easy responses from the free energy principle side of things. There, it's like the saxophone is a ness, or like is a framed thing.
Yeah, sure.
You've got all of these constraints, but there's still some spontaneity that is adjacent to all of those things, but is not pre-statable in terms of them, is not predetermined essentially by them. So is not ultimately, it's enabled by them, but it is not, I guess, again, determined by them. It's not dictated by them. It's an adjacent possibility. And that's the, and you got to find, mechanistic or material in the scientific conversation. And I don't think it's hard, because again, I think this is really, what we do in molecular biology when we talk about origins of novelty. But, you can find these empirical correlates of like variation as such, this adjacency, but you're always defining that. This is Matt's metaphysical point, in relation to some other frame. But what you're saying is, in terms of the way it's going to go, it's not already pre-statable in terms of this particular frame, even though, again, molecules in Brownian motion are exploring a state space that is predefinable in terms of, the thermodynamics, but it is not predefinable in terms of possible phenotype space that's going to be explored or something like that, right? So there's a lot of, outside of a given important frame that you could say is, interpretable or constrained by some other frame, but that would just be avoiding the question. That would just be some sort of to say that then the thermodynamic frame is fundamental and the phenotypic frame is just an illusory emergent thing or whatever. You talk about
so I think Dreyfus would maybe, and I want Matt to come in because I've spoken too much, but I think Dreyfus might want to say, he's not here, and he maybe wouldn't have even thought about it, that the fundamental frame is background understanding, is a kind of always ever-present familiarity, even in moments of total disorientation, in the same way as one could argue that for Heidegger, it's possibility. It's the capacity to project into the future that is revealed in moments of angst or anxiety that is like still there. It's still a kind of kernel. You don't lose yourself entirely in anxiety. What is revealed to you is he has all of his negative, it's apophatic terms, but is ultimately possibility. I think for Dreyfus, there's a similar kind of inframing ultimately in terms of background coping, familiarity, or just a disclosure of intelligibility, something like that.
But for a human or for some kind of organismal agent, but unless you're positing them as, primordial or absolutely fundamental, then you still have to have a genetic account of the origin of something like background coping, which means that it isn't always already pre-framed. You still need an evolutionary story of the emergence.
Right, which I think he would just turn to kind of stand. I mean, I don't think he would have thought about this. Would just turn to standard evolutionary theory or whatever. But,
exactly, and wave it away. But that's the problem. Sure. That's problematic. I'm coming out of here. But also, phenomenologically, we could make reference to things like experiences of pure consciousness, or what happens when you smoke 5-MeO DMT, or whatever. Like there are actually situations and experiences in which background coping and all that framing like goes away. You can have those experiences.
So for this, I'd want to say that we need, and this I think is where we need analytic philosophy, careful analysis of what phenomenality is. So for this, I really like the work of Raphael Millier. He's got a paper in Australian Journal of Philosophy called Constitutive Self-Consciousness.
Mhm.
Because one thing you might think is, well, like the kind of Zahavi model is, even in these moments of radical perturbation, disturbance, you maintain a form of pre-reflective self-awareness, a forminess, as Zahavi describes it. And Raphael's point is, well, if you actually look at what these theorists are talking, people like Zahavi, Uriah Kriegel, they're either making an inflated claim, okay, there's actually a quail of forminess, which we don't actually seem to be able to justify as being in our experience, or we're talking about the mere Hegelian what it is likeness of experience, or phenomenality, the fact that experience just makes a difference for a subject's phenomenology. Now, I know you're going to jump down my throat about the invocation of a subject there, but if we just take that, I think what the point there would be that in the 5-MeO DMT example, in Metzinger's pure consciousness example, yes, absolutely, you're getting rid of reflective self-awareness, maybe even any kind of egoic. Now we don't take, now that the notion of pre-reflective self-awareness is so deflated, we get rid of all forms of egoicism. And yet what remains is a kind of phenomenality. And this is the conversation I've had with Metzinger about exactly what the kind of content of those states are. Yeah. But they're not, again, back to our kind of Dreyfus point, they're not unconscious.
Yeah,
right?
But so
and I think
is unconsciousness, this is my other question, is unconsciousness, deep sleep, general anesthetic, blunt force trauma to the head, is that relevant to this question, right? Are we unframed in, I'm being slightly facetious, but we have experiences of complete cessation, not intentionally invoking nirvana, but and then a recapitulate, a reemergence, right? But is that relevant to this discussion? This almost becomes hard. Yeah, go on.
There's the epistemic problem too of only having access to these
phenomenological
states through memory, right? And so
right, that Metzinger raises that problem as well, and he writes about it in his book, The Elephant and the Blind, where he goes, well, like all of these testimonies could well be confounded by the fact that they're reconstructed. The question about non-consciousness, I would probably, and again, there's going to be a kind of investment in any metaphysics, a kind of consciousness first or idealistic metaphysics. Although, if anyone's lasted 3 hours of this talk, I'm allowed to say that I have a slight penchant for those kind of metaphysics. Is that I think there's an argument to say that in terms of the kind of capacities we're talking about, there is no real disclosive being going on there. So it's not, I think those kinds of, they're interesting, of course, and the transitions in and out of them are very interesting. But I would say that the actual states themselves are irrelevant. There's also a question, is actually what I'm going to be teaching in an hour, which is interesting, on the value of consciousness. Because you want to say, well, like you can get into these kinds of pure phenomenal experiences or psychedelic states where every kind of notion of familiarity, history, comfort, background coping are eliminated. This is an ongoing discussion in analytic philosophy of mind is, well, if you were Thomas Nagel, for example, you would think that any time you have consciousness, you have some intrinsic positive value. Whereas there are other people, so there's this guy called Lee who wrote a paper in Phil Studies. He goes, actually, consciousness is intrinsically neutrally valuable. So I think part of that conversation comes in, right? Do you think a world is better if there is an organism there who experiences the most kind of boring, everyday experience like a flash of light versus an experience versus a universe where there's no experience? I very much lean into the kind of positivist view because I think, but people have their different intuitions, and we kind of reach bedrock. Yeah. I don't know what you think about.
In this case, I'm a positivist too, in this sense.
Right.
But I don't know, just in terms of trying to get at these, whether we think of them as subjectless or frameless experiences. Yes, of course, there's the issue of, well, we can only recollect after the fact what they might have been like, and so we're reconstructing it. But I've found that you can get better at remembering. Just for example, with not 5-MeO, but just DMT, having done it twice within a span of 20 minutes, the second time I was shocked to discover how quickly I had forgotten the intensity of the first experience 20 minutes later. But I feel like with more experience, you begin to close that gap a little bit, but there's still always going to be this issue. Gentlemen, I need to get some sleep. It's I know you guys are just getting your day started over there, but um, a takeaway for me here is that one can always offer an active inference account of any sort of situation that seems to um, run afoul of the frame problem. I mean, I was thinking of Heidegger's example of the hammer, and if I'm really rushing to get this fence built and my hammer breaks, and my buddy, Ralph has a wrench that he left at my house that I could use as if it were a hammer. But then I think
Mm.
of the social context. Well, I'm probably going to damage the wrench if I use it to hit the nail, and he's going to be upset at me. And like, could we conceivably program Optimus, or some robotic system with a very advanced, Bayesian inference program running to make that kind of a judgment? Like, whoops, my hammer broke. I'm supposed to finish making this fence. Can I use something else that's not a hammer? Well, does it have the context to, can we create in principle uh, a super huge internal model that would allow it to know all the social context of whose wrench that happens to be that was left there? Or is it going to be stuck in, no, that's a wrench, not a hammer, and I can't hit a nail with a wrench? That doesn't make any sense. I think you could always tell an active inference story about how an internal model could be large enough to include all of that context. But what does that really get us? Then it's just a description,
Mhm.
right? It's not actually explaining how that process works, which is my takeaway from your paper. I don't know if that's getting the point.
Right.
Maybe that was only one of the points.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. So I have, I'm going to obviously let you sleep, but I have a paper that again is just now under review, where I very much try to make this claim much more robustly that with at least, without its kind of normative, overly constraining core, active inference becomes a merely universal descriptive scheme. So absolutely, I'm in agreement with you. I mean, maybe next time, what would be worth discussing is the distinction between description and explanation,
Yeah.
because it's a genuinely undercooked philo science problem. Like, there's actually really not that much work on it, like on what an explanatory norm is, on what explanatory power is, on why description doesn't count as explanation, on how the role of prediction in explanations, all of these kinds of constellation of similar ideas. But yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, I think that's one of the main takeaways. My takeaway is I've had a cracking time. So,
Yeah,
that's
this is brilliant. I mean, one last thing about Whitehead's way of doing metaphysics. He says metaphysics is
mm,
descriptive generalization, which I think
right.
is his effort to say to scientists who are seeking explanations to, as Tim started saying, philosophy should be the critic of abstractions, ultimately, right?
Yeah.
Not
Yeah,
to
yeah.
explain away. The danger is sometimes certain scientific frameworks will try to explain away aspects of the prosaic or the manifest image. And so Whitehead thought
Mm,
we need a descriptive generalization that is robust enough that it applies across all the special domains of science, but also all of the domains relevant to human life, including art and spirituality and law and everything else that we do, so that we know when an explanation becomes a greedy explanation or greedy reductionism, say, in Dennett's sense. So we don't explain away things that either are presupposed actually by the practice of science or that end up leaving us with a ethically impoverished, view of human life. So I think
100%. 100%.
this
Yeah.
descriptive generalization, I think, is a good way of approaching what metaphysics is after, not explanation.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
That's why Chalmers, and we're not going to get into that, has it's another of the problems with the hard problem formulation. It's that he makes it a metaphysical problem, although he doesn't say that explicitly. But in metaphysics, there is no why, right? Here, there is no why. So that's an issue that he has there. But I completely agree with what you're saying, Matt. I think explanation versus description will be really interesting to get into, and what you guys are both sort of saying is echoed by Simondon, but also Hegel, right, with his Owl of Minerva.
Mm.
hmm yeah,
So, but Simondon would say these are my words, but basically that an effective theory is always post factum, right? So it's
yeah,
always
yeah.
descriptive in that sense, right? So after you've got a situation, then you can describe it. And what masquerades as explanation often in sort of, physical theory, operates in terms of priors that are themselves unexplained, right? That are unexplained explainers, right? So you can explain, and this would be a, Dennettian how come type explanation. So it's really a mechanistic explanation. You can explain the behavior of, an idealized particle in terms of dynamical laws, but those dynamical laws themselves are taken as given and usually read off the behavior of the empirical observations of particles, right? So, I mean, there's a circularity there where it ends up presenting itself as explanatory. And so, again, the function of speculative philosophy is the critique of abstraction, that Whiteheadian way of viewing it. This is what I've tried to bring to the Levin discussion of Platonic space and all of that. It's like whenever you are appealing to these a priori forms, you're saying the buck stops here. Right? We can't explain this thing, right? This form has no genesis, but I can use this to explain the genesis of like variations on that theme. And I mean, the Darwinian thing is, again, it's identitism, it's the universal acid, and that's what philosophy is too, It's I will critique this a priori and see if indeed you can't put a block in inquiry and just say this can't be, no genetic account, no genealogical account can be given of this. And then just to go back to what you were saying before, Darius, I'm not jumping down your throat about the subject, but when we not by fiat, but when we remove the non-conscious state from the discussion of the frame problem and say, well, there's no being disclosed there, so it's irrelevant, then we are saying that subjectivity is grounded.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that would be exactly the potential for the Heideggerian Dreyfusian.
At
least the Dasein-centric move. Yeah.
And of course, then it's just another tautology, right? And I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with certain kinds of tautologies, as you know, but of course the subject is framed, right? The subject is defined by a frame, right? And so my big issue, to go right back to the beginning, with the history of Western rationalism, is too much modeling the shebang in terms of the subject. Despite all of the nuances that Matt is always really great at bringing up and everything, there's too much projection from experience onto everything else. Whereas what we're doing in speculative philosophy is trying to infer something more general, like infer from experience something more general than experience. So the Schellingian thing, right, Matt? Schellingian inversion of Kant in a sense, right? But it's like, okay, now we know what the subject is like. We have to ask what must the world be like in order to bring forth subjects of this kind without simply assuming their existence. And so, I mean, you could get into Meillassoux and other things, and I don't think he handles this all that well, but he has a point to be made about ancestrality and stuff. Many views, at least, my view, maybe not yours, Darius, maybe not yours, Matt, but I'm not a panpsychist, right? So I do think I take seriously the appearance that there are real non-conscious or non-experiential states in the world, and indeed that there may have been a time in an evolutionary process where those kinds of states, and I think it's at the origins of life in a sense, right? And not necessarily like light bulb that's, it's a like many things in evolution, there's a gradualist story to be told here, but I don't think we can simply presume it's really a metaphysical claim, the metaphysical generality of the subject, and then say, well, thus everything is always already framed as a way of solving the frame problem. That's begging the question again to me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool.
Explanation and
can I just say
description.
Can I say one final thing?
Sure.
Absolutely.
I just want to mention Kierkegaard, because you mentioned Hegel's Aula Minerva. I feel like one would be hard-pressed not to invoke Kierkegaard. On two fronts. Your kind of acid tests, Kierkegaard said, anything can be immersed in the acid bath of irony. The constant subversion, right? And Kierkegaard, of course, famously said that life should be lived forward and understood backwards. The other person I would want to, well, there are two others here. I know, Tim, you might have a problem with this first invocation, but Hans Jonas says the survival standard is inadequate for an evaluation of life. And the last would be
Which he
Bergson.
gets from Whitehead, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, right, right. Cool.
I'm gonna have to respond to that as you brought it up. But yeah, continue, continue.
And then the final one I want to just say is Bergson, who said, so these are all quotes at the beginning of this new paper that I've got. Mechanics deals with something finished and not processes. And Bergson has a really beautiful this idea of like all actuality, all potential being captured within a kind of single moment of actuality. Bergson's got a really nice analogy where he goes, that, you know, that is not the way creative unfolding, creative evolution happens, right? It's not like the final image that I'll leave you guys with. He goes, it's not like I'm thinking this is early 20th century or late 19th century France, like a woman's fan where it's all kind of concealed and then it all just emerges and it was always already there. And so you could have perfectly predicted it. He's like, no, that's not it.
Yeah. I mean, of course, that's Prefamationism. And
Right,
you know,
right,
but
right.
it's great for his critiques of that. And in terms of the argument against mechanism there, you know, Kungiem, all of those guys, of course, those French thinkers are downstream of Bergson and heavily influenced by him, although many of them critique him in various ways as well, of course. But Kungiem and essays like Machine and Organism and like, you know, it takes an organism to create a machine, not the other, you know, so organisms can't be machine, like all of that stuff really well fleshed out there. Just the thing on the survival and, you know, Whitehead's obviously the art of persistence is to be dead versus, you know, Peirce's extremely pithy distillation of natural selection principles as, you know, things that are good at persisting tend to persist. And there's a really important difference there. And again, maybe it's too much to get into, but you know, persistence isn't something that's being maximized in evolution, and so you know, we shouldn't treat, you know, Darwinian theory and like, you know, subsequent evolutionary theory, you know, in terms of Spencer's little silly phrase, you know, survival of the fittest, right? Like, so survival is not something that's being directly selected for as such or maximized in biological evolution, and organisms like sacrifice themselves all the time in various ways, right? And there are all kinds of different strategies, like R selected versus K selected species, like producing a huge number of, you know, very altricial, undeveloped babies, neonates, that 99% of which are going to die. You know, that's one strategy, as opposed to K selected species, which are like producing very small numbers of very precocial, well-developed organisms, or sinking a huge amount of time into rearing them, like humans and elephants and blah 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 do, you know. And so the kind of, you know, the caricaturing of the evolutionary process in terms of just survival, is a little bit of a problem. I mean, Jonas is another one of these people who has a lot of really good stuff to say, but I think he just doesn't fundamentally understand the basic issues. Like he doesn't understand what the mechanical philosophy is, even though he actually gives a bunch of really good higher level critiques of it. His overall solution, which is to bring form back, is a real misunderstanding, because the problem with the mechanical philosophy is that it's entirely formal. You know? So anyway, but yeah, Matt knows, and we just had a back and forth about it. I don't think that little quip from Whitehead that Jonas is riffing on as well is one of his finest moments, but that's a long discussion.
Yeah, no, I'll resist the temptation to hash it out here. We did read The Function of Reason together, and
It's a great book. I love that book. I actually love that book, and there's a lot of really great evolutionary reasoning in there. But at that little moment where he goes for rhetoric and tries to kind of score a point, then I think, yeah, it just, what I really like about Peirce's, you know, things that are good at persisting tend to persist, is that it's a metaphysical tautology that gives us a way of understanding how, you know, certain forms become more prevalent than others, and it's unobjectionable, like it's a proper tautology. And it's not that that there's some kind of maximization, optimization, or even value associated with persistence. It's just persistence.
yeah.
Like,
Well, I guess I just take Whitehead to be making the exact point that you're making,
yeah,
really, and he's critical of the Spencerian
yeah.
reduction of evolution to survival. You know, and so taking the quote out of context, I think, might misconstrue what Whitehead's point was there.
Totally fair. And
Sorry.
I do. No, your fault. Well,
But
you got me
uh,
started. I love, Matt, that your response is usually to my critiques of Whitehead that no, Whitehead is he thinks what
He agrees with you.
he thinks what you think. You agree with Whitehead. I'm like, well, yeah,
Anyways, this was fun, you guys.
yeah,
Appreciate your time and your insight and your great paper, Darius, for the
Thank you.
occasion
Well,
making this
awesome paper. Yeah,
possible. So
well, thank you for having me, guys. It's been a real honor, pleasure, privilege, all the above. Really good, really fun.
until next time,
yeah.
Until
Thank you.
next time.
see you later.
Yeah.